Members of council, if you can please take your seats. This meeting is now resumed. Before we start, I'd like to welcome the grade 5 students from Humewood Community School. Councillor Mihevik.
I would like to welcome the great students of the wonderful school of Humewood's Community School who are right there, and they're some of the best kids in the city of Toronto.
Okay,
And there's another one here too.
So, Councillor Bilal, she asked, she missed an item that she wanted to hold on page 17. Yes,
That is item CC 32.7.
What's it
158 Sterling Road, draft plan of subdivision appeal to Ontario Municipal Board.
okay,
No?
thank you.
I thought it did, but it didn't.
All right, members of council, before the recess, council was considering requests to make items time-specific. Councillor Pasternak has moved that council consider item EX 2711 on commuter parking on Wednesday after item LS 21.1 on a tow truck industry review. Now, I believe Councillor Perks, you wanted to...
Okay. Thank you very much, Speaker. I know it's unusual to speak to one of these requests, but I thought it was kind of important that we do that because we have certain practices here about when an item is time-specific. Generally, it's for one of two reasons. There may be staff from an outside agency who normally aren't here, or perhaps there's a large number of members of the public, say with the tow truck item, who want to be here, and we want to be able to tell them, you don't have to sit here for 3 days and wait, so we schedule it. The item that Councillor Pasternak has asked to be time-specific doesn't meet either of those tests. Now, I appreciate that Councillor Pasternak is passionate about this. He's so passionate, in fact, that this isn't even the first time he's brought this. We had an almost identical item that the councillor brought on commuter parking on the subway line in January, and we approved it in consent. Further, the recommendations, if you look at it, are to ask the TTC to do something. It's not even something within our purview. Now, I understand Councillor Pasternak is passionate. Many of us get passionate about issues that are here, but if every time one of us cared about something a lot, we had to make it time specific, our agenda would become a mockery because we don't have that many slots. And you'll all remember the number of times we've had a timed item for 2 o'clock and we can't do it because we're backed up with 4 other timed items. I understand sometimes there are special people who need to be here and can only be here at a certain time, and doing it for that reason is fine. I understand when there are a great many members of the public who want to be here to watch us debate something. That's not the case here. This isn't even something we should be debating here. It's a TTC item. So I'd urge you just to try to keep some sanity around establishing the agenda. In this instance, despite Councillor Pasternak's strong interest in it, to vote no to making it time-specific.
Thank you. Councillor Pasternak?
Yes, just for clarity's sake, the reason I wanted it on Wednesday morning and no later is come Wednesday night is a holiday of religious significance for the Jewish community. I will not be here either Wednesday night or Thursday or Friday. Therefore, I'm trying to get the items that are of particular concern to Ward 10 dealt with before that time. I believe that meets the criteria that Councillor Perks is referring to.
Thank you. So we have a motion by Councillor Pasternak. Did we want a recorded vote? Yes, please. Recorded vote.
Councillor Mihevik, please. Councillor Holland, please.
The motion carries 29-7.
Councillor Fletcher.
Yes, thank you, Speaker. Councillor Shiner suggested, and I certainly agree, that we do page 17, CC 32.11, appointments to Toronto Hydro Board of Directors at the same time as we're going to do the annual financial statement. So I'd like to move, we put those together.
That
and
we
combine.
put those together.
Yes, please.
Okay, on favor? Carried, thank you. Deputy Mayor Minnan-Wong?
Thank you. I just got to find the page number. It's Public Works 23.9, Eglinton Crosstown, LRT, at-grade segments. Page 11. Thank you very much. I am happy to release it. I have read the report, but I do believe Councillor Brarnetti even has more questions than I might have. Holland, pardon me.
So we'll put it in Councillor Holland's name? Is that it? Okay. Councillor Burnside,
Yeah, I had a hold. I'd like to release it.
what page?
Thanks, Joe. Page 7, 21.13, I think, right?
Training for city councillors?
Yes, that one, thanks.
So you're releasing it?
Thanks.
Okay, on page 7, HL 21.13, Councillor Burnside is releasing. On favor? Carried. Councillor Holliday.
Thank you, Speaker. I'm not able to indicate my name on the screen, but I'm able as well to release an item that I held. I understand Councillor Cressy has a motion to refer an item to Public Works Committee. So that is on page 7, HL 21.14, motion to reduce the number of doorings in Toronto.
Okay, so Councillor Cressy, you have a motion.
I have a motion to refer this to the Public Works and Infrastructure Committee for consideration. I've spoken with the chair of the committee, who's supportive of this direction.
Okay, the motion is on the screen. On favor? Carried. Councillor Fragadakis?
Yes, I was wondering if I could make an item time specific. I don't know what times are left, if any, but it's item CC 32.8 on
What page?
17. It's the Ombudsman Toronto Report Inquiry into a complaint about the Committee of Adjustment Notice Procedures. I don't know what's left. How's Wednesday morning look?
I don't, is Wednesday?
How's Wednesday afternoon?
I think we already have something. Why don't we revisit it? Why don't we revisit it tomorrow? Okay? Because I don't know what time's available. At this
Okay.
point, we won't have any time available.
Okay, I'll wait till tomorrow.
Councillor Fletcher, did you?
To have a clarification, around every day we confirm the time. We confirm the time-sensitive items. So setting it for Wednesday, we're going to reconfirm that. That's my understanding after what happened
Yes.
last time. So
Yes.
the only things we're setting now are Tuesday in stone. Things might change
Well,
tomorrow
no,
for
we
Wednesday.
did. Yeah. If we get to them today, but I think that we do have, there are some motions that we passed for Wednesday. Did we not pass Wednesday? We passed Wednesday as well.
And those have, what standing do those actually have? Does that have to be confirmed on Wednesday or
Yeah.
Tuesday?
Yeah.
Yeah, what?
Okay,
Every council, every day, we
I
confirm
understand.
it.
Every
Yeah.
day we have to confirm
Yeah.
it. Thank you.
Counselor Carmichael Greb.
Thank you. I just have an item to release on page 13, NY 24.35.
Okay, just one
Payment in lieu
moment,
of
just one
parking.
moment, page 13.
Page 13, NY 24.35.
Yes?
I just want to release it.
Okay, that's on page 13, NY 24.35, payment in lieu of parking, 1940, 42 Avenue Road. All in favor? Carried. Okay. All those in favor of adopting the order paper and all items not held, recorded vote. Okay. Okay, just one moment before you push, before you press the button. EX 2712 and EX 2727. Councillor Pasternak had an interest in that, so we'll vote on those two items separately. Councillor Pasternak? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, on EX 2712, recorded vote.
Fillion?
Councillor Perruzza, please. Councillor Davis. And Councillor Thompson, please. Councillor Perruzza, may we have your vote, please?
The item is adopted, 37 to 1.
Okay. On EX 2727, recorded vote. Councillor Pasternak, you still have to stay.
Councillor Fillion and Councillor Fragadakis. Councillor Cole, please. Councillor Fletcher. Thank you.
Councillor Karagianis, please, and Councillor Davis. Councillor Perruzza, please.
The item is adopted unanimously, 39 in favor.
Okay, thank you. Yes. Councillor Pasternak? We're done. Okay. Our next item is CD 22.9. Councillor Shiner had an interest. Recorded vote. CD 22.9. It's on the screen.
Councillor Perruzza, Councillor DeGiorgio, Councillor Wong-Tam, please.
Councillor Fillion, please. Councillor Burnside. Councillor Fletcher. Thank you.
The item is adopted unanimously, 40 in favor.
Thank you. Members of council, I want to stress the... Oh, yes. All in favor of adopting the order paper, recorded vote.
Councillor Mahevik, please. Councillor Fillion, Councillor Cole, and Councillor Fletcher, please.
Councillor Wong-Tam, please.
Counselor Fletcher, please.
The motion to adopt the order paper carries unanimously, 40 in favor.
Thank you. Members of council, I want to stress the importance of preparing your motions in advance. The clerk staff are here to help you prepare your motions. In particular, if you intend to move a motion during the release of votes, I will insist that your motion be prepared in advance and given to the clerk. If you do not have your motion ready, I will not recognize you, and I'm also reminding members that you must state your motion first before you speak to it. Members, City Council follows a routine for the processing and adding of any motions without notice during the meeting. Please remember that a motion without notice must include a reason for urgency. If you have an urgent motion without notice you wish to bring forward at this meeting, please give your motion to the City Clerk staff. They will prepare the necessary procedure motion for my review along with your motion. The chair must agree the motion is urgent before you can seek leave to introduce it at this meeting. It will require 30 votes to add a motion without notice to the agenda during the meeting. Motions added to the agenda in this way are not subject to a vote to waive referral to a committee or agency. I will be reviewing all motions carefully, and I will advise after each recess which motions need a motion to add to the agenda. Members, before we begin, the mayor's key item, I just want to express council's best wishes to Toronto Police Chief Mark Saunders as he undergoes surgery today. He's having a kidney transplant today, and we look forward to seeing Chief Saunders back on his job after his recovery. So best to Mark Saunders and his wife. We'll now go to the mayor's key item, which is EX 27.8. which is on page 5. Do we have questions? Councillor Fragadakis.
Thanks, Madam Speaker. Through you to staff. So I noticed in their presentation at committee that researchers from the University of Toronto noted that work at Trent University has found a critical width of pavement above which bird populations decline markedly. Before planning a bike path or a paved access point in the ravines, we need this type of quantitative study to help us make more conscious and informed decisions. And I was wondering, is that research from Trent currently a part of our analysis of paths in the ravine? And if not, will it be moving forward?
You, Madam Speaker, can you repeat the end of the question? It was hard to hear it all. We're trying to figure out who best to answer it.
Okay, so it's on page 3, where I quoted from the work at Trent University, where it says, the quote starts, "Work at Trent University has found a critical width of pavement about which bird populations decline markedly. Before planning a bike path or a paved access point in the ravines, we need this type of quantitative study to help us make more conscious and informed decisions." So I was just wondering if that research from Trent is currently part of our analysis of paths in the ravine, and if not, will it be moving forward?
So through you, Madam Speaker, I'll begin and then likely turn it over to planning. I think the short answer is that it's not currently part of the work, but it would be part of any management plan that we would move forward with. And there is a recommendation in the report that speaks to bringing together a number of different institutions to speak to that type of research together.
Okay. My next question is the overall report from the U of T was an eye-opener for, I believe, all of us. A couple of passages from their report stood out for me. One was in 1997, 10% of the ravine canopy was already covered by non-native tree species. By 2015, it had increased to 40%. And if this trend continues, in 2050, 60% of the ravine canopy would be non-native species, and the ravine will be eventually a green desert. I thought that was quite depressing, and it just speaks to how important all of the hard work your staff have put into developing this strategy. I was wondering about the group's focus on philanthropy, and I wonder if it would not be more a general stakeholders table. And I was wondering if I could get your thoughts on how that and how you might implement recommendation 2B.
So through you, Madam Speaker, and then I'll ask Mr. Ubbins to speak directly to the tree canopy question. The report does recommend a number of different stakeholder tables. One would be the philanthropic table that we're calling Ravine Leaders. And another is that we continue in the stakeholder advisory group that has been put together just around the creation of the ravine strategy. So I think there's a number of opportunities for all of those things to happen at the same time.
Can we add academic researchers into this Ravine Leaders group?
Certainly through you, Madam Speaker, there are currently researchers there, and we can add any that are interested in being involved at that table.
Okay. So might follow up on the canopy?
Yes, the U of T submission spoke to one particular area in the ravine system in Toronto, and there had been a lot of Norway maple in that particular area of the ravine system. And there are places throughout the ravines of Toronto where we have a lot of presence of invasive species. And invasive species, by nature, of definition, are going to invade bigger and bigger areas if they're not managed. And as we move forward through this strategy, those areas would be targeted for management.
Okay. The report further notes that instead of obtaining seeds from nurseries in Ohio and Oregon, we need to use these old trees representing Toronto's local genetic diversity to restore the ravine forests. I'm wondering if this is something we're doing, should be doing, and will this new strategy help us get these sort of fine detail tactics correct?
Through the Speaker, this is something that Toronto can be very proud of in its efforts over the last several decades already to advocate the growers to source seeds locally. And we work with the Ontario Native Species, I forget what they're called exactly, but it's a group of experts across southern Ontario that are very busy collecting and advocating collection of and growing then of native species from local seed source. So we do our best here too in Toronto to buy them when they're available. The Toronto Region Conservation Authority even goes so far as to collect and grow on their own native species such as that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Al-Jamari?
Excuse me. I want to ask two sets of questions. One has to do with the financing of the strategy, and the other has to do with the differences between private and public ravine systems. So for the financial portion of it, can I get some indication of just how much money are we willing at this point to commit?
Through you, Madam Speaker, the report and the recommendations don't actually speak to any money at this point, but rather that part of the implementation approach would be interdivisionally between Parks, Forestry and Recreation, City Planning, Toronto Water, and Toronto Transportation, and the Toronto Region Conservation Authority. We would come back with a coordinated capital budget where we would coordinate as many projects as possible that are on the books and also identify priority investment areas for the next 10 to 20 years. So that work hasn't been done yet.
Prioritize investment areas.
Correct.
Paid for how?
We haven't identified what those areas are yet or what the required funding would be or how much of those investments may already be represented in a number of different capital budgets. So that would be the next step of the work.
So we're not committing any dollars today?
Not through this report, that's
okay.
Correct.
And then the next set of questions, the difference between private and public ravine systems. Has that been taken into account?
Through you, Madam Speaker, yes, as part of the review, and that's why we had the Toronto Region Conservation Authority participate as well, because essentially they have the regulatory powers to manage the privately owned ravines. As under provincial law, they have field regulation permits that they issue and can control encroachment in ravines, as opposed to the publicly owned lands already. So the TRCA has been an active partner in this initiative, and the intention of the ravine strategy is to look at the policies right across the whole natural ravine, and the city would focus on the public lands while we would work jointly with the Toronto Region Conservation Authority to try to manage the same policy issues on private lands.
I thought you said, sir, that the TRCA has the regulatory power to deal with circumstances on private ravines. Doesn't the city?
It's true, Madam Speaker. What I'm speaking about is for permits and authorities to do any work in ravine areas. The Toronto Region Conservation Authority has that power to control what gets built in there on private lands, also on city lands. We have to apply for permits to the TRCA whenever we do work, even on public lands. So that's on the regulatory control. With respect to the ravine policies we have, I'll hand it back to Janie.
Thank you.
So through the Speaker, I would just add that the city's ravine and natural features protection bylaw applies to all ravine lands, regardless of whether they're in private or in public ownership.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Wong Tam.
Yes, thank you very much. I'd like to ask a question regarding the capital funding that will be required to execute this broad vision for the ravines. Do we have a sense of the actual quantum that's required? I know it's early days still, but you've...
Through the Speaker, I'll speak for Parks, Forestry and Recreation, and perhaps Mr. De Geronimo can speak on behalf of Toronto Water, where the most significant budgets are in this regard. So we don't have a quantum for the entire strategy as of yet. There's still work to do around priority investment areas, and there's still work to do collaborating amongst interdivisionally and with the TRCA so that we can effectively use our combined resources as effectively as possible. And that would be the report back that we have recommended within the strategy moving forward.
Through you, Madam Speaker, with respect to the work that Toronto Water is doing in watercourses and ravines, we have a number of projects already committed and some already built, like the Earl Bales stormwater facility. We have another stormwater facility that's under construction in Emery Creek, another one to come up in Bonner Creek. So we already have tens of millions of dollars allocated for stormwater work in ravines. On top of that, just dealing with watercourse and erosion issues for Toronto Water specifically, over the next 10 years, $122 million have been allocated to date. With respect to the Toronto Region Conservation Authority and funding from Toronto Water over the next 10 years, there's $148 million allocated already in the Toronto Water capital budget to fund a lot of their programs that are in ravines and watercourses. So significant money already there. It's about coordinating when we're there, who else will participate.
Thank you very much, because I recognize that there was no actual quantum in the report, but in my conversations with staff and some of the working groups that we've had regarding Mud Creek or Yellow Creek, the Vale of Avoca, I know that we're talking in the magnitudes of hundreds of millions of dollars. And I know that you haven't been able to pinpoint a number for that. But I'm just very curious because recognizing that the quantum is going to be significant, there's your recommendations before us speak to on several occasions the need for charitable organizations to participate, engaging in private sector philanthropy opportunities. Like, if those recommendations don't come to fruition, if we're not successful in building those strategic partnerships with private organizations and philanthropists, what is the backup strategy? Because I get the sense that there's some fingers crossed. We're hoping that they're going to come up with lots of money to help us out. But in the absence of that, what happens next?
So through you, Madam Speaker, there is, as you've noted, there is the quantum of capital funds is not identified in the report. We have, and the report does speak to some successful partnerships we have had in the ravine system around philanthropic contributions, and the Lower Don Trail and that work that was recently completed and much work to continue in partnership with Evergreen is a perfect example of that type of philanthropic contribution. Moving forward with this ravine leaders table, what we would likely do is identify the base work that needs to be done from a capital perspective in the ravine system, and then a number of priority areas for investment, as the report says, where we could add on to that base layer of work with philanthropic work. So the idea is that we look after the entire ravine system and add to it through some philanthropic donations.
So during the deputations at the Executive Committee, a number of communities came out. One of the issues that was identified was the lack of resources currently within the divisions to help us keep the ravines clean, debris-free, to ensure that there's a waste management component with respect to encampments or perhaps illegal dumpings. Is that going to be captured in this report?
Through you, Madam Speaker, the report does not speak to any additional operational resources to support the plan at this time.
And with respect to development encroachment, which does it does speak to some components of the impact of development encroachment, there is no language in here talking about the shadow impacts that would take place if we have tall buildings very close that cast a very long shadow on these sensitive ecological areas. There is nothing that protects that.
That would be, through you, Madam Chair, that would be covered through an analysis of a development application against the applicable official plan policies. So, for example, if there were shadow impacts on a nearby ravine, that would be evaluated in that context.
That was your last question. Thank you. Councillor Perks.
Thank you, Speaker. To the General Manager, I'm trying to get my head around this issue of ecological integrity and the baseline work. In answer to a question from Councillor Fragadakis, you said there was some sort of a advisory table?
So through the Speaker, there has been throughout this work, and there is recommended in the report. I'll just note recommendation or action number 5, which is to expand the network of partnerships with the Toronto Region Conservation Authority and with academic and educational institutions to identify research needs, develop baseline inventories of ravine health, recreation use, and public engagement activities, and improve monitoring and reporting in Toronto. So it is identified as an action item in the plan.
Okay. When the deputation came from the University of Toronto, they expressed concern, both in this deputation and also when the interim report came forward, that we hadn't done the field biology necessary to properly enumerate the species and the various ecosystem functions that those species perform. At committee, Councillor Robinson moved an amendment that using science available at the University of Toronto Faculty of Forestry or similar centre of research to develop baseline information and address the capacity of city staff and its partners to get the work done. What measures, in addition to what you had already planned, do you think you will need to do in order to meet that direction should this council approve it? That advice from committee.
Through the Speaker, I'm not sure. I think that would be the work that would have to be done with that working group. I couldn't speak exactly to what those additional measures would be at this point in the work. I do understand that there's a number of different ideas of the working group about how to conduct those measures, and through the recommendation of Executive Committee, this specific approach was recommended for consideration as one of those basic measures, and we're certainly willing to continue doing that work with that group.
Well, again, to be clear, the scientists who wrote the presentation that was given at the Parks Committee, at Executive Committee, were very clear that in terms of looking at various indicators of ecological health, of species diversity, and so on and so forth, the work done to date does not meet the standard of international research, specifically ecological integrity. And committee very clearly said we have to do better and try to achieve what the University of Toronto is talking about. Do I have your undertaking that we're going to change our approach and do more field work to establish the baseline, which is what they were arguing for?
Through the Speaker, there's an enormous amount of work that needs to be done when one would write up management plans to improve and protect the integrity of the natural systems, habitat, and so on in ravines. For that, we need baseline data on a lot of things. both plants and fauna. We have to go back in the records and find out what was there, what naturally grew there, but we've also got to find out what's happened to our soils there and how that's changed the system, and what could be done to either restore it or protect it as it is and try to move on from there, from its current condition. And it varies site by site. The city is so fragmented that it's an enormous amount of effort, and there are multitudes of baseline data that we would need and we would seek out through experts.
Yes, I appreciate that. The reason I don't want you to feel pushed here, but I guess I am pushing. Recently the World Wildlife Fund put out work saying that maybe 2% of North American ecosystems are intact. And I just want to make sure I have your undertaking that before we start putting in new impacts, new uses in there, we will do the proper field work, the biological field work, to have the baseline. Is that the order of operations? Field work first, impact second?
Through the Speaker, yes. You have our commitment to that undertaking with the appropriate academic institutions as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Davis, question?
Thank you, Speaker. I wanted to ask, well, it's a 10-year plan, and the actions are laid out in short, medium, and long term. Can you give us some general understanding then when the short-term, medium-term, and long-term actions will actually be budgeted?
So through the Speaker, if I can clarify, because when we speak to the 10-year plan, we're speaking more specifically to a 10-year capital plan and the 10-year capital planning framework that the city operates in, and that 10-year strategy around how to coordinate our relative capital plans together. When we speak to the Ravine strategy, we are looking at this as a foundational strategy that would be longer than 10 years. Because
I understand that. I'm
okay.
talking about the actions. So the actions are laid out in short-term and long-term, quick wins, short-term and ongoing and long-term. So when are the quick wins supposed to go into effect?
So through the Speaker, the quick wins are items that collectively we believe we can move on through the existing 10-year plan to some capacity, although the actual dates have not been exactly put together yet, and they would come back in the implementation strategy that we have coming back.
It's hard to pass something when we really don't have a sense of the timelines on these. So, in general, it says we're going to do 3 ESAs. The number one concern expressed at deputations was that we had 84 ESAs plans that need to be developed, and only 3 are identified as one of the quick wins. Now, I did hear in questions that there were 53 being worked on, but so it doesn't add up to me. What are the 3 that are going to be completed? When, for instance?
Through the Speaker. So the next 3 are going to be developed and implemented within the next 5 years. I don't have the names of those here, but they will be done. It takes a lot of resources to do that, so we will work it through. We've already completed 8 of them in the past.
But there's 80 some odd.
Yes, and we continue to work through them. But the big thing is that they were all inventoried, so 86 new ESAs were added.
I'm sorry, I don't understand. I guess I'm really trying to understand the implementation timeline, particularly of the management plans for the environmentally sensitive areas. Can you just give us more information? There's 84 of them. This recommends 3 within the first 5 years. So when are we going to see the remainder completed?
So that'll be part of the implementation plan that is coming back in the first part of 2018.
Okay. For instance, as well, in the long-term plan, it asks for us to look at, in partnership with the TRCA and other stakeholders, undertake an assessment of potential climate change impacts on the ravine system including impacts on the natural systems and existing and proposed infrastructure. That's a long-term action. How long are we going to wait until we do climate change analysis on the ravines?
Through you, Madam Speaker, we've been working with the Toronto Region Conservation Authority and also Environment Canada, looking at some of the different changes that are being proposed on floodplains. They have to remap the floodplains. All that baseline data has to be done first before we can see what the impacts are going to be. As we do projects, though, we are incorporating some mitigation measures based on storm conditions, on works within ravines and rivers, or even that feed into the ravines. For example, some of our basement flooding works.
But this says it's a long-term.
It's put in the long-term section because
You're saying it's ongoing and
any
long-term?
capital that's eventually put into play will be long-term, as well as there's been no final decisions on how you're going to assess what are the true impacts to our ravines based on climate change. We're still discussing what are the changes and what's happening in those ravines. That has not been finalized.
Climate change adaptation strategy.
Exactly, but we have the strategy just talks about it. It doesn't document the impact to the ravines from a flooding perspective or any changes to existing standards.
That was your last question. Thank you. Councillor Carroll.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. My questions might take Councillor Davis's question and boil them down to a summary. I'm following on the question that I asked in executive committee. There's a difference between a prioritization framework and an implementation plan. We don't yet have an implementation plan in our hand.
Through the Speaker, that's correct.
So what we have here is what should be happening in Toronto's jewel of a ravine network. What you could do in 10 years of work, and the prioritization framework turns into an implementation plan if we keep pace with the funding requirements. Is that in a nutshell?
Through the Speaker, that's correct.
Okay. So the good news is I heard that there are a few that you're proceeding with, some that are done, a few more that you're proceeding with. So we should see them in the itemization of the 2018 budget?
Through the Speaker.
Rate-supported budget?
This will begin with the 2019 budget.
With 2019, sorry, yes,
2019 10-year capital plan.
So we start in 2019, and we should see some items through the first 5 years of our capital plan from 19 on.
Through the Speaker, that's correct. And I should note that some of the quick wins or the short-term items in this plan, parts of them are already represented in our 10-year capital plan. It would be a matter of coordinating them so that they happen, at the right phase, so that all of the divisions can be aligned appropriately.
Right. And so the future council, if they want to keep pace with it, what we have, the prioritization framework shows them what's a high priority. The matrix shows them what's a high priority, and if you want to continue to fund, here's where we will go next. You would update that matrix as we go along?
Through the Speaker, that's correct.
Okay, then I only have one other question, because each time we address our budget, we can see if we're keeping pace. I have one other question. I couldn't find it in the deeper report, and maybe I'm missing it. I have the experience in my area where we actually achieved a fair amount of this through development funds. We made it a condition where, as often happens, developers want to come back and develop along a ravine. And the ravine in question, we had to reestablish where it's top of bank, and we also had a ravine that badly needed to be renaturalized. The 60s type of development, someone had simply Johnny Appleseed thrown whatever into the ravine, non-indigenous species, and lo and behold, flooding, choking, and collapsing of culverts. Is in the plan, is there also a recommendation that takes us to making it a hard and fast policy so that planning department never miss that opportunity to try and realize some of the work that could be done on the ravine strategy if the site is adjacent?
I think, through the Speaker, it's already part of the city's official plan that we would require a natural heritage impact study when development is proposed adjacent to a ravine. And as you've outlined, that's the type of conversation that takes place, and often we can secure a remediation strategy for the adjacent ravine.
And that would be outside of, you wouldn't be in a situation where a councillor would say, well, I got different plans for section 37. Outside of that, you would still be able to secure it.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. Those are my questions, Madam Speaker.
Councillor de Bearmaker.
Thank you, through you, Madam Speaker. And my questions are to staff, and I think they focus on the same letter, or the University of Toronto letter that we've all, I think, read and were impacted by. Is my understanding correct? We have about 10,500 hectares of ravine lands in the City of Toronto, ballpark. Let's call that a big box of ravines. Of that big box of ravines, what percentage have we done actual biological inventories of? Would it be 10%, 50%, 90%?
Through the Speaker, I don't think there's a definitive answer on that. A rough estimate just through staff right now is likely less than 5%.
Right, because not the only, and I say this in a respectful way, I guess what we've done in the past for the ESAs, and when we did our official plan reviews to designate those ESAs and places like the Frank Faubert Woodlot in Scarborough, we will send out a team to do a biological inventory or a biological study. But that's, I'll call it, for those special gems. I represent a ward that has Highland Creek in it. Again, my guess, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, is I would say maybe certainly less than 20% of Highland Creek has actually been studied to do a baseline biological inventory, because there's not many ESAs at all in Highland Creek except at the foot of the Scarborough Bluffs. So you'd say most of Highland Creek has probably never had an actual formal biological inventory.
Through the Speaker, I believe that would be correct.
So if I had a motion, and maybe I can work offline with you, because we had talked earlier. So if I asked staff to report to the Budget Committee during the 2018 budget process on what it would take to cover that other 90% of the land mass that we've never actually formally studied and put into an ecological integrity report, could you do that?
Through the Speaker, with respect, I think that the recommendation before Council is for us to report back with an implementation plan in Q2 of 2018. I'm not sure if the level of work that you're requesting could be done in time for this year's budget.
Right, and through you, Madam Speaker, but my understanding is that that report does not include doing a biological inventory of the city's ravines. And if I want us to do a biological inventory, maybe it'll even take 10 years as the rest of the plan, but I don't think you're planning to do what I'm asking you to do, correct?
Through the Speaker, the intention as we move forward through the time as we do capital work through our ravines is to actually improve those ravines, protect them and improve them. And in order to be able to do that, we'll need that kind of data. So each time we go into any kind of area of major capital investment, or anytime we've got priority showing up on our system saying this is an area that's in high need of capital work and or protection or enhancement, then we would have to have those kinds of data in order to inform our plans.
So if I use Highland Creek again as an example, because I understand the Water Department, for example, has done some emergency sewer work at Centennial College.
Just to add to that, Councillor, just so you understand the reason why we're trying to coordinate in this strategy. So Toronto Water did complete a geomorphological study on Highland Creek, which looked at the health of the aquatic habitat and any improvements as we had to do some work through there.
Yes.
What we didn't study and need to study still is the flora and fauna.
That's right.
And what we're trying to do is coordinate those two in future.
And through you, Madam Speaker, I'm assuming, because I know that file and I see Mr. Snodgrass in the not the audience, in the chamber as well, but we did that study of the river because we were afraid Bellamy Road was going to get washed out and the sewers were going to collapse.
Through you, Madam Speaker, yes. particularly was road crossings, major road crossings, as well as underground infrastructure. We had sanitary sewers that we had to protect, and water mains.
So through you, Madam Speaker, and this is where I'm differing perhaps with the input that staff is giving us. If staff overall is saying to us, in Highland Creek, for example, when we have to do sewer work, stabilization work, road work, then and only then will we do a biological inventory. Other than that, Councillor, you could be in this building for the next 20 years and nothing's going to happen in Highland Creek, correct?
That was your last question.
Through you, Madam Speaker, no, I believe the intention is to slowly complete studies along the way. However, what we would do as a capital working group is maybe prioritize when those studies will be done or when Toronto Water would undertake certain capital works. So by having council endorse the strategy, we could meet as staff and start reordering our capital programs based on priority, and that way we can do them both at the same time, because right now they're not happening at the same time.
Thank you. Speakers, Councillor Carroll.
Oh, does the mayor want to go first?
The mayor will be speaking last.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I don't have a motion to move. I am very pleased with the addition that was made, especially after the case that was made for it at Executive. I don't know that whether or not my colleague who just questioned last, Councillor de Beermaker, was present for the presentation or watching from his office. But I am confident that in the timing that staff can actually execute the types of studies looking for, it is all captured in the term embedding ecological integrity in the report. I'm not sure that Councillor de Beermaker is listening to me now, and he may in fact be working on a motion that is not in fact necessary. Because what the University of Toronto asked staff to embed in the strategy encapsulates exactly the types of things that Councillor de Beermaker is discussing now. The definition of ecological integrity, and I had to ask about it a couple of times of the delegates from U of T, because it is a relatively new concept. New as in the year 2000. 17 years ago, it was actually, a definition was agreed on so that it could be used in a similar strategy for Canada's national parks, and that is that an ecosystem has integrity when it is deemed characteristic for its natural regions, including the composition and abundance of native species and biological communities, rates of change, and all supporting processes. And what that means is by embedding that terminology, going beyond just the language formally used of keeping environmental standards, but actually embedding that concept of ecological integrity, where these inventories need to be done, where we need to go beyond flora and fauna and into actual biological species of all types, that we are today, by adopting these recommendations, giving staff the authority to do that. What's important to me is that we keep in mind that we need staff every year to continue to report to us that they've been able to deliver what they expected to deliver each year in the first 5 years and the second 5 years, and that if they have the capacity to do more, they can. Because certainly what they can achieve in a decade will make lasting and sustainable change. But it does in fact include everything that Councillor de Beermaker was asking for, but on the public services terms. They do understand from the presentation they received from U of T that they're not going to have the type of naturalization and health of the ravines without doing those types of inventories, without knowing that they're not only sustaining ravines that look good, but that actually can sustain the life forms that were meant to be living in them, and in a way that's safe and doesn't jeopardize any when they move beyond those ravine lines. So I'm grateful to the deputants who came forward. Surprisingly, we made jokes about it at the time because they came forward with someone we usually are at odds with environmentally. Mr. Scribner came, who represents the industrial community, and yet he brought forward with him the folks from the U of T to tell us that with that addition in the strategy, you really will be encompassing all the work that needs to be done for every species in the ravine, or that should be in the ravine network within our community within the time frame. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Councillor Davis to speak.
Thank you, Speaker. I too rise in support of the report and recommendations that are before us, and I do want to thank all of the staff who have been involved in the development of the ravine strategy. I wish I had brought the map of Ward 31 because I could show all of you, and I'm sure there are many others who are in the same situation, that I have a massive green, wide green band that goes right through, diagonally through the middle of the ward. And that ravine, which is the Taylor Creek Park, is a branch of the Don and extends all the way out then into Scarborough. It is an important waterway, and it is the major green space in my ward, and probably in other people's wards. But that green space is not just a park. It is the main location of massive sewer infrastructure. It is the same location where we have trails and we have recreational uses. It's the same space where we have natural restoration going on, wetlands and other naturally, and it's the site of an environmentally sensitive area. So what we have in the City of Toronto is this absolutely incredible natural legacy. Our ravine systems are, as I said at committee, the lungs of our city. They are what make Toronto what it is, and are very highly recognized around the world that the City of Toronto is a green city. So we have to make sure that the first priority is to protect these. It is so loud in here, Speaker. That the first priority is we must protect the natural heritage, the ecological health of our ravines, and we have to do this in a way that brings together all of the departments that have something to do with that ravine. And so I'm very pleased. A few years ago, I brought forward a motion around the Taylor Massey Creek, and the Taylor Creek Park, asking that the divisions come together and develop a master plan for that watershed, and also a management plan for that park, because it is so special. So when some of the stewardship groups would say, we want to naturalize this area, and others would say, keep those picnic areas manicured. We didn't have a set of priorities, and we hadn't had a process to say these are the uses. Sometimes they conflict often. And how are we going to balance those interests and plan for them in our capital and operating budgets? And how are we going to make sure those departments, parks, forestry, Toronto Water, Transportation Services, Toronto Hydro, who's in all of our ravines as well, are working in cooperation so that we plan the work we're going to do in those ravines together. But for me, the most important thing is, what do we tell our residents? What are the plans for our ravines? I had 2 meetings where almost 200 people came, and I put up a giant map of the ravine, and I gave out sticky notes. And we had so many lovers of the park and ravine, and they put up sticky notes all over that map of all the things they wanted to see done in that ravine and that ravine park. And I handed it over to where? It went kind of into an operating budget wish list. And there wasn't any mechanism for making sure that we at least had a plan for how those ravines were going to be improved and protected, and that the community would be involved in those decisions. So I'm looking very much forward to the last stage of the Taylor Massey Creek park management plan, where the community will get involved, and I hope stay involved through different supports for stewardship groups as we finalize our plan, and that we do this across all of our watersheds. The baseline work will get done. The inventories have finally been done. We will have a good sense of the health of the ravines, what needs to be done to protect them for the future, and a plan for how we achieve it. So thank you very much for your work on this. I look forward to continuing to work with you on it.
Thank you, Councillor Davis. Councillor Wong Tam to speak.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I do have a motion I'd like the clerk to help me put on the screen. And it's broken down into two parts. One, the first motion is really to try to develop a stronger policy and connect it to the official plan with respect to development encroachments and impact on the ecological system that we know as the ravine. And oftentimes when it comes to shadow impacts, there is this sort of gray area, and let's just call it shadows, all over the policy. I can recall so many times where I've raised this with planning staff of, why are we not caring about the impact of the ravines and shadows and development? And it's oftentimes the response has been, we don't have enough in the policy itself. So let's fix that once and for all and make sure that that policy gap is bridged. The second part of the motion is really to ask that we consider in the 2018 budget process an actual regular maintenance and litter strategy for the ravines and the system that we know as sort of the linear and connected green spaces of Toronto. We know that there are endless acres of land that are interconnected through the city, and some of it we travel to, and some of it we don't, because there's probably not proper pathways, there's not safe and improved access, and we have to make sure that that takes place so you can build out the infrastructure to service and maintain the ravines. What we've noticed in the areas that I'm in, which includes the Railsdale Ravine, the Yellow Creek, the Mud Creek, the Vale of Avoca, and all the connective tissues there, is that there is a enormous amount of debris that seems to find its way to the bottom of the ravine, and we are hearing from staff is that they don't have the capacity, they don't have the resources to go clean it up. Now, I can't imagine that before we go and launch into this massive strategy on how we're going to make sure that capital investments are there, that the baseline conditions of the ravine are going to be ensured by adopting this overall strategy, by going off and having conversations with philanthropist organizations, as well as bringing the thought leaders to the table to help us guide our policy. I can't even imagine doing all that work without taking a look at what we have as a baseline condition today. And the baseline condition today is that we have debris in our ravines. We have people who are living in the ravines. We have a lot of construction material and building materials that have fallen into the ravines, and we've got no way to remove it. So if we're talking about a baseline condition, I'd like to think that we were, at the very least, Madam Speaker, be able to keep our ravines in a good state of order. And that is, at the very least, it has to be in the 2018 budget. And so far as I can tell, it has not been in the previous budgets of City Council adopted budgets. So we have to make sure that that takes place. The other thing that causes me some concern, but I know that we're still early days on, is that there seems to be a lot of reliance and talk about making sure that the private sector, the philanthropist organizations, institutions are going to be able to come to the table and help us fund the capital work that we need to do in order for us to maintain the ravines. And from experience, watching City Council and the public staff go and have these conversations with corporations, have these conversations with philanthropist organizations, doesn't matter what project, whether it's building subways or perhaps building stadiums and everything else in between, I don't think we've often seen the private sector step up the way we anticipate them to, especially not when we're into the quantums of hundreds of millions of dollars. So I just want to put that just put that before us one more time, is to understand that it's not just it's really hard to concentrate, folks. Like, I recognize there's a lot of conversations, but it's not just the fact that we want the private sector to help us, but they're going to be asking the very critical question, which they ask every single time, is where is the city going to be on this particular subject when it comes to funding and supporting the ravine systems. And so we're going to have to get ready to answer that question, because before we go out and talk to philanthropists, organizations, and corporations, we're going to have to ask ourselves, what do we want to do and how do we fund it? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor DeBeermaker.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And if the clerks could put up my motion, which is similar but different than Councillor Wong-Tam's, I'm requesting that city staff, that Council direct city staff to report during the 2018 Ravine Strategy Implementation Plan on the funding required to create and complete a biological inventory and ecological integrity report of Toronto's 10,000 hectares of ravine system. Madam Speaker, I think all of us saw, and that was done with the cooperation of my colleague Councillor Carroll, who said, do it this way, it's probably a more efficient way of doing it, and I take her wisdom and advice and have amended the motion accordingly. Madam Speaker, I think many of us, when we saw the University of Toronto letter, it hit us to realize that we're really fixing things in the dark sometimes. And as somebody who has enjoyed our ravine systems and the beaches down at the Scarborough Bluffs ever since I grew up, I realize now, with my involvement in the Rouge Park, 50, 60 years ago, we got lucky, and some summer student, a gentleman named John Riley, was doing a biological inventory of the Rouge Marsh. I don't want to call it a make-work project. I'm sure they had very honorable goals. But 60 years ago, they created a biological inventory of the Rouge Marsh. That was really the only biological inventory done for the next, I would say, 30 years. Then we had a gentleman named Mark Heaton who worked for the MNR, who came back 3 years later, to do another biological inventory of the Rouge Marsh. And unfortunately, the results of those two studies showed us that we had lost the majority of the species richness and species diversity in that marsh, and that the marsh as we knew it 30 years ago didn't exist anymore. It had become simplified, it had become weaker, it had become poorer. Most of us going down to the Rouge Beach wouldn't know that. You would park your car, you would look at a wetland, you would go and play volleyball on the beach, and then you would go home. We need these baseline studies to tell us, are we doing a good job? Are we gaining ground? Are we losing ground? I know as a member of the Conservation Authority, we do forest report cards and canopy report cards in cooperation with the city and with the universities and other institutions, but I think it's very important during the implementation strategy, that we actually be given a plan and a price tag and say, if you believe it's worthwhile to have this information as a baseline, this is what it's going to cost you. And if it's too expensive to do in 1 year, maybe you can do it over 10 years or you can do it over 15 years. But I've been on this council for 14 years now. I wish 14 years ago a councillor of the day had stood up and said, it's going to take us 14 years, but we're going to do biological inventories of every single ravine system in the city of Toronto, from Steeles all the way down to the lake, because we'd be finished today. But that didn't happen 14 years ago when I first got elected, so I'm hoping perhaps during that 18 implementations plan, and maybe it gets into the 2019 budget by who's ever sitting at this council, and maybe it takes 10 years after that, but maybe sooner or later we will have at least some baseline of what's out there. We've lost a lot already, but we don't even know what we've lost because it's never been measured. For the vast majority, staff said maybe 5%, maybe 10%. 90% of our ravine systems, we don't know actually what's in them. So when we lose things, we don't know which way we're going. And actually, when we have victories and we improve things, we don't know which way things are going. The Rouge National Park's had a bit more attention. We now have mink and otter in the Rouge National Park. They didn't exist here when I started out in the Rouge 30 years ago. We have black bears now coming down into the Rouge Park over to the McDonald's, and unfortunately for the black bears, sometimes they wander out of the park and they get shot. But for our ecological diversity, most people didn't know whether those species existed 30 or 40 years ago. The eastern bluebird in the Rouge Park, again, has made a comeback thanks to citizen action putting up bluebird boxes, something as simple as that. But again, 30 years ago, we had no idea what was actually out there. So I'm hoping with the wise counsel of a couple of my colleagues that this motion can be brought forward to us, put into the report, and then we as a council can decide whether we actually want to do it or not when staff come forward with that implementation plan. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
That would be.
Thank you. Councillor Al-Jamari.
Thank you. Speaker, this ravine strategy before us is a very important piece of work. It is a set of principles that we will put into action. And one would question just how seriously we are going to take this. The degree with which we put actual city dollars behind it will reflect the degree of seriousness, I believe. Because if we don't fund this adequately, it will not become a reality. These ravines in our city provide the spines of our city. And they come down, both of them, and they really are the lifeline of our city, supporting the rest of the body of the city. They are a real jewel in the city's different communities, and they provide biodiversity that is unparalleled. I don't think most residents of the city understand how important it is to have these two lifelines in the City of Toronto. The protection of this resource is tantamount to keeping the city as healthy as it is. So we need to get it right. I saw the school children here today from Humewood, and I would never think that they would pollute ravines the way I've seen the adult population throw their old toilets, sinks, and household renovation materials down our ravines. You and I, Speaker, we've seen it all. It's disgusting. Thank God the education system has changed to one in which the school children are taught how to reinvent and recycle and protect our natural environment. And they get it. School children get it. So that's half the battle won. We have some of the oldest vegetation in North America in our ravine system. They are pristine. They are majestic. And we ought to be extremely proud of them because they are life-giving. I'd like to point out that the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority staff are here, and Carolyn Woodland, thank you so much for coming. We are at the Conservation Authority absolutely tied to this strategy, and in fact, it was on the agenda last week as an information item, and I understand it's going to be coming back for more input, and I welcome that. Because this is a good start. I don't believe this is the final outcome that any of us want. It is a wake-up call, but we need to do a lot more. And in that vein, I would urge you to support Councillor de Bearmaker's motion. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Robinson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'll be very brief. I just wanted to thank staff for their excellent work. It's a great piece of work, and pleased to see the strategy moving forward. I was happy to place a number of the motions that the U of T contingent that appeared at Executive Committee put forward. The internationally recognized concept of ecological integrity to measure the state and health of ravines, using science, and doing the research based on the, developing a baseline information in it to address the capacity of the city and its partners to get the work done. And then lastly, incorporating the Ontario Invasive Species Act into the strategy. So I think those are all great amendments to what is already in play. I also, they talked a lot at Executive about the green desert, and I thought that was an interesting comparator or analogy. I also say this, that I think this is a big job, and government cannot do this alone. We need to partner with as many stakeholders as possible, whether it's private sector, volunteers, corporate partners. We need to do it together. And I always like to give a shout out to Mark Cullen, who's a real champion and very in tune with the value of trees. And I think there's nobody who has more insights than Mark Cullen, and I know he would love to get involved with this. Also, I think the corporate community, the corporate sector, the private sector, there's all sorts of corporations that would chomp at the bit to get involved in this, and so I'm looking forward to going down that path, as well as just plain old volunteers. I know in my ward, people would love to get into the ravines and lend a hand, bring a shovel, and in one case, we spent about a year trying to make that happen in the Blythewood ravine. Finally, it is now happening, and they gather there on Fridays to do a little bit of civic engagement and play their part. So I don't think everything's about money and staff. I think this is about direction and guidance, and it concerns me when I hear some of my colleagues saying, you know, we need this, we need that. I think we have a pathway forward. I think it's very exciting. I think staff have done excellent work, and I think we can do a lot of this with what we already have. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor McMahon to speak.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. So I think the Ravine strategy, which this was the original book, and there's a draft in the making, and then you will hopefully get, each councillor will get one of these fantastic books with all the information in it. Ravine strategy is a fantastic strategy for the City of Toronto, similar to our Transform TO strategy and cycling plan. It's moving us forward. So the good things I like about it are our ravine leaders, the working groups, the Ravine Trust, so we can compile funding and we can get creative in our revenue sources with philanthropy and looking at conservancies, things like that, which is what we're going to need to do. And, sorry, Councillor Perruzza, I can't hear, sorry. Also, all the outreach, the phenomenal outreach to key stakeholders and their input and involvement. And I'll tell you, people all across our city love our ravines. They are unique to Toronto, probably the most unique ecosystem, I would say, ravines in ravine ecosystem in the world. And so we had people, philanthropists like Ken Tannenbaum, very much involved. We had park people, we had Evergreen, all kinds of partnerships, which is what we need to look at. And Evergreen did a phenomenal job celebrating our ravines the other weekend with Ravine Days weekend and the opening of the Lower Don Trail, which I would encourage you to go to. This is probably one of the best cases of city staff not working in silos and showing, disputing that myth and showing everyone across Toronto how we can all work together. And I said this at Executive Committee. It was phenomenal at one of our think tank workshops where Jennifer Keesmaat was a little bit late, so Janie Romoff did her slide presentation for her, and then Jennifer did Janie's. So they both can, even though they're different departments, they both know this policy so well, this works so well that they can just cover for each other. And you had Lou DeGeronimo working together with Jennifer Keesmaat, with Janie, with Barbara Gray, and everyone working for the greater good. The other reason why our ravine strategy is so important, of course, we know what's going on down south with all the horrific storms, hurricanes, flooding, all that situation. So it's moving us forward with our climate change adaptation, with resiliency, and furthering our Transform TO ideas. So we are very lucky, as I said, again, to have the ravines. We need to protect them, appreciate them, and everyone go out and enjoy them. And put something in your newsletter to remind your residents about our ravines and to get out there. I also want to compliment Councillor Robinson on her motion at Executive Committee to include U of T and their ideas, and Richard Ubbins for finding a staff member he can totally devote to our strategy. Thank you.
Councillor Doucette to speak.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. First of all, thank you to staff for this report. I will definitely be supporting it. As you know, being the City Councillor for Ward 13, I am honoured to have High Park and the Humber River running through my wards. So we understand how valuable it is to keep these amazing areas we have. I know there was one round table I went to one time for the Chief Planner, and the ravines were called the Green Highways. And that's so true. A lot of our wildlife, which we love actually to see in our parks, in our back gardens, use these ravines as their highway to come into our city. We must make sure that we protect them by continuing to remove the invasive species. Community groups are great with this. I have an amazing group in High Park who every week they're out there removing the invasive species, but then also what they're doing is planting native plants which they are growing in the greenhouses from the seeds they gather from the park as well. So they work very well with city and park staff, and that's great. So you've got community groups working with our staff. We must, and we are also very aware that thousands of people use our ravines for all different sorts of activities, whether it's just walking, whether it's riding a bike, whether it's running your dog. Some of them are using mountain bikes in places they should and places they shouldn't. But we have to balance how our residents use these ravines and make sure that we do preserve them for our future generation. We must also preserve the areas which are ESAs, environmentally sensitive areas. We must do that because they will hold plants which are in danger. We need to make sure that we look after them, particularly when we have new development coming in. Again, I have High Park south of Bloor. I have major development coming in north of Bloor. And residents want to make sure that our park and our ravines are protected so that as these developments come in, it's not just looking at a building. These buildings could be blocking off underground rivers, hidden rivers. That will affect how our ravines work when there's a stream running through it. So all this has to be taken into consideration. It's not just what you see on the surface, it's also what is underground. So on that note, Madam Speaker, thank you very much.
No one's listening to me.
Thank you. Councillor Perruzza.
Thank you, Speaker. Speaker, I'd like to move a motion, and I believe the clerks have it. And we're just finalizing the wording for a bit. If there's somebody else that can go, that wants to go ahead of me, they may. No, okay, sure. So I have a motion which I'd like to move.
Okay, hold on.
Which the clerks will put on the screen.
Hold on. I don't think that the staff have your motion.
They do.
You ready? Okay, so can you read out your motion, please?
Okay, I can read it out, sure. That City Council requests the General Manager, Parks, Forestry and Recreation to incorporate a plan, so not remove the word consider, to incorporate a plan to connect the Humber River Trail south of Highway 401 to the existing trail at the Humber River and St. Philip's Road. So the reason I ask that, Speaker, is that you may know that that in our trail system and in our park system, we have had a connection of that trail. First of all, let me preamble this by saying that I'm hoping that the report that we have in front of us just simply doesn't become a report that sits on a shelf and that makes a statement. It becomes a report that where we actually go in and do some of the things we say we're going to do, because our ravine system is absolutely precious in so very many ways. And one of the precious elements of our ravine system is how Torontonians can actually access in a continuous way our park system and enjoy that park system. It is an oasis in the middle of what otherwise is a very busy urban environment, and it's absolutely wonderful. It's a wonderful place to go, to enjoy, to relax, to bird watch, to cycle, to walk your dog, and all of those other things, to exercise. Speaker, often I ride my bike down in the Ravine system and I see people sitting on park benches renewing relationships. It's a wonderful place where all kinds of things are always flowering. So, and all my motion does, Speaker, is simply ask our staff to look at a trail connection that is broken. At Humber, there's a trail that sort of begins up at Roundtree Mill Park, meanders down just south of the 401 at the 6 Points Plaza. It breaks down because there's a golf course and there's a steep bank. And our staff have had a plan to make that connection. And I don't know how long it is. It's probably in the neighborhood of 300-400 meters, maybe even less in the ravine system. To make that connection, because otherwise you have to come out of the ravine. Basically, you're out on Weston Road in a very busy area, and it's a real broken link where that really breaks it up for folks who want to enjoy that part of the ravine system. So we have had a plan in the books now for the longest time. I don't know, longer than I've been here. So that goes back. Because I asked about it very early on when I came onto council, what the plan was. And I was told that the plan was back then to make that connection. And every time a sort of a big event came along, plans were made to create that connection. The last one was during our Pan Am, our Pan Am conversations, where that link would be part of the Pan Am funding, would be part of the Pan Am legacy, where there would be continuity in the system. And as you can see, if you Google it today, or if you happen to ride your bike or take a walk, you will find that that link has not been made. I understand that it is somewhat complex, but we have been known to take complex and make it very, very simple, very, very easy. We've done that on so many occasions, and I believe that we can take complex and make it easy here as well. So all my motion does is simply ask our staff to come back, let us know how they can take complex, simplify it in a way that makes that link available to Torontonians to be able to enjoy as we move forward. So thank you, Speaker, and I'm hoping that this report actually becomes an action report as opposed to one of those reports that ends up on a shelf that we'll pick up 10 years from now and say, man, this report is so full of dust, right?
Thank you. Councillor Perruzza, you do realize that that link is in Ward 11?
And this is why I'm moving it, Speaker, knowing that...
No, I just want to know if you knew that. We do have questions for you, Councillor
Absolutely, I knew that was your...
We have
that was your word.
Councillor Holliday, clarification of the motion?
Yes, thank you, Speaker. I'm just trying to understand the broken link. I was there on Saturday, and I'm trying to picture where the missing. I wonder if the councillor could elaborate a little bit better. I know the golf course is there. Is it the golf course that's the gap? Are you proposing to buy a golf course so we can put the trail through, or what is it that's missing?
Yeah. So I've seen a number of versions of a potential link. One in the bank between the golf course and the top of the road. I was shown that some 10 or 11 years ago when I first came onto council. There's also been another link, which is, I believe, in the golf course that would require an easement or a small portion of the golf course on a fringe to allow that easement to take place. So there are a number of different versions of how our staff can take complex and make it simple. It's just a question of which of those routes they they choose to undergo.
Okay, so we have a trails plan, I think it's called the Bikeway Trails Plan, that covers a lot of these ravine trails. Do you know if this is in that plan or not in that plan, and if it's not, why not?
I believe it's in the plan, in that it's something that they've always intended to build and to achieve. It's not in the plan in that the connection currently doesn't exist today, but it's always been on the books and in the plan to do. I've always been told that it's in there to do, and how you do it, that's the question mark.
So if it's in the plan, what does it have to do with the ravine strategy?
Because it's very much part of the connectivity component of the. So if you look at the ravine strategy, it deals with lots of different elements, and I know that you've looked at it. And one of those elements is under the title connectivity, how you connect these things and how you connect these trail systems and other uses. And that's what my motion seeks to do as part of that work, to basically bring back a report that speaks to how we may take this, what is otherwise appearing to be a very complex issue, and make it simple and doable and achievable.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor McMahon, questions, clarification of the motion? Councillor McMahon?
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Councillor Perruzza, through you, Madam Chair, to Councillor Perruzza, did you speak to city staff about your motion?
Oh, I've been speaking to city staff about connecting that trail for the last 11 years very directly. I've met with them on a number of occasions. I believe I also spoke to former current Councillor Hart when he was general manager at the Parks Department. I raised it a couple of weeks ago at the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority, where our staff made a presentation on this very report, and I raised it with them then. I asked the questions about the connections and the connectivity. Absolutely, it's been something that's been ongoing, and just continue to ring the bell on the same issue. Councillor, as you do the same
Great.
on many others,
Okay, I think
and you
that
ring
was a
it to the
long-
point where people get fed up with hearing it, and they make it happen. They say, here's how we can
All right,
make
next question.
turn complex and make it simple.
Next question. Did you speak to the Chair of Parks about your motion?
I may not have spoken to the current.
That would be me.
You know what? Better late than never. I'm currently speaking to the Chair of Parks right here on the floor, Council, and I'm saying to the Chair of Parks, this is such an important element in terms of connecting the Humber Trail from sort of the northwest limits of the city right down to the bridge. I think it's called the Trudeau Bridge. Is it called the Trudeau Bridge or Pearson Bridge? What's the bridge called? Oh, it's called the Humber Bridge. So you take it from Steeles, you can take that trail from Steeles all the way down to the Humber Bridge, opens out onto the lake. They have these beautiful rocks you can sit on, have a sandwich when you get there.
It's
Are
clarification
some
of the motion only, please.
I know, and it's more succinct answers, please. And so is some of this land private property?
Yeah.
Just to describe it,
It's my ward.
some of it is not. Some of it is not. There's a bank.
Is some of it though?
Private.
Some of it may. I don't know all of the details. Some of it, as Councillor Doucette says, it's private, and I trust that it is. But that's part of the. Why, to some degree, it's been complex until we decide to make it simple. It's my understanding, and a very direct question to our staff, that we also have the ability that if it's in the city interest, to be able to go in and take private lands and make them public so that we can create that connection, so that people can enjoy a continuous trail, a continuous link through our river
So
system.
last question would be.
No, that was your last question. I'm sorry.
He took too long to answer them.
Well,
My last question was,
I'm sorry, but it's only 3 minutes, I'm sorry. Councillor Perruzza, if you can just please just answer the question. Councillor McMahon, I'm sorry, your time's up. Councillor Karygiannis, maybe you can get somebody else to ask your question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you to the member. Clarification of the motion. And certainly, I might be out of order here, and the chair might, but I don't think that you need to have somebody's permission to put a motion forward. Am I correct in this? I don't think you can put a motion without having to consult anybody else in this room. That's your privilege.
Councillor Karygiannis, where is this asking a question on the motion?
I might be out of order, Chair.
No, that's not. That's not clarification. Please. Do you have a clarification on this specific motion?
Yes, I was wondering if my colleague might also want to inform us about the conversation that he had with the TRCA on this issue, and the strength that he put there forward to make them understand how important this is to him.
But this is still not clarification of the motion.
Because I want to know what the...
But I'm happy to answer it,
I'm sorry.
Speaker. I'm happy to answer the question.
No, I don't want you to answer because it's not a question.
What's your question?
Now, do you have any clarification on the motion, on his specific motion?
Madam Chair, he did say that he spoke about this at the TRCA, and my clarification that I want to know is, did he present a similar motion there, and what was the answer, and what was the outcome, and what passion he spoke about it there?
Okay.
It's
clarification of the motion only, not what he said. It's the clarification of the motion.
Yeah, so my motion basically is asking our staff, as part of the Ravine strategy, as they come back with more determined plans about how they achieve some of the objectives that they talk about in the report, vis-a-vis erosion, vis-a-vis controlling invasive species, vis-a-vis making our trail system and our park system better connected so that Torontonians can better enjoy this ravine oasis that runs right through the middle of the city. And I did raise the issue when this report was presented at the TRCA, and I didn't feel that my motion was appropriate at that point, because while the TRCA has responsibility for issuing permits with respect to these matters, the connectivity, the connections would be created by the City of Toronto.
How will this affect your ward? I mean, is that just one part of the area?
So this connection is not actually in my ward.
It's in
Councillor
my
Nunziata's
ward.
ward down in the City of York. So while the trail system...
Point of order.
So the
Chair,
Humber
why
River...
don't you let him answer the
No,
question,
but
you versus
it's not
jumping in?
clarification.
That question was intended to him, was not intended to you.
It's not
So
clarification.
Give him the courtesy, Chair, to let him answer.
Thank you, your time's up. Thank you. Councillor Pasternak, do you have a question?
Yeah, thank you.
Clarification of the motion.
Clarification of the moment. The way the motion is worded is you're simply asking staff to incorporate a plan. You're not asking them to do any work or to execute any capital work. You're asking them to incorporate a plan.
So there, as you know, the report that we have in front of us, the recommendations, which I don't have right in front of me right now, basically speak to, in general terms, on how we develop a ravine strategy. And then one of the recommendations is that staff in 2018 come back to us with more finite plans on how they will achieve many of the objectives they outline in the report. So one of those objectives in the report is under the headline, the connectivity. So how we make these connections. So what my motion would do is, as part of that, so when they bring back those plans, bring back a plan on how we can take this other complex connection. That's why I've been told it hasn't been created for many, many years while it's on the books. Take complex, simplify it, and show us how that connection may actually be built, so that Torontonians seeking to enjoy our ravine system can do so continuously from Steeles to the lake without having to come out onto Western Road at 6 Points Plaza.
You're asking...
Is it 6 Points
You're
Plaza?
asking for...
Oh, it's not 6 Points Plaza.
A plan only.
Sorry. Huh?
You're asking for a plan and nothing more.
Precise. Well,
Thank you.
it's a plan along with all the other plans. So it's not asking to make the connection. It's basically to come back and let us know how that connection might be made with their other reports.
Thank
Is that
you.
clear, Councillor?
Yeah. Thank you. I think that we've exhausted that question. So that's, Councilor Perruzza was the last speaker, and the Mayor Tory.
Well, Madam Speaker, thank you. And I'll try not to take too long in just beginning by saying thank you to the staff. And that includes the staff present and past, because I think this has been a long road, and I want to acknowledge the presence, the contributions of the staff that are here, as well in particular to give a shout out to Jennifer Keesmaat, who I know took a keen interest in this when she was the Executive Director of Planning. I want to thank the councillors. A number of them over time have had this as something that's very dear to their hearts. And then there's organizations like the TRCA, Water, which you might not have thought of being directly involved, but they have been. And I think what we have here, and I want to speak to this because I think it's very, very important every time we do something like this, the first thing you have to do is come up with a strategy. And I think the strategy that has been developed here, protect, invest, connect, partner, and celebrate, I mean, to summarize under the headings, is the right thing to do. You cannot implement properly, you cannot even prioritize properly, and I'll come back to that word, without a strategy that sets forth what it is you're trying to do in strategic terms. And the staff and the others involved, all the partners, I'll call them, in the Ravine strategy have done that. Then we come to a word that seems to just, I don't know, strike fear into people's hearts around here, because every time it's deemed to be some giant conspiracy to avoid doing things. But certainly my own experience, implementing lots of strategies over time in business, and it doesn't matter whether you're in a business or government or a nonprofit organization, is you have to have the framework that we're asking for in these recommendations to implement this strategy. There has to be a prioritization. The first question I got asked in an interview I did yesterday on radio was, well, what are people going to see first? And I talked about the fact they're going to see things that allow them to connect to the ravines, wayfinding, accessibility questions, and so on. That's probably the first thing they will see. I'm not saying I rank that first. It's actually not my job to rank first, second, or fourth what the things are. But the notion that we don't prioritize for, yes, in part financial reasons, but also just so that we know how we're going about implementing the strategy in an orderly fashion, to me is just, it goes without saying. That's what you have to do next, is have a prioritization. And I would just say to those who are, who are sort of quaking in their boots about the fact we're going to prioritize, which to them seems to always mean things you're not going to do, fear not. I think this is an important priority. I think the vote on this is going to show that Council believes it's an important priority. I'm encouraged already at the fact that there are some funds that are set aside in different places, and I'm going to mention that point in a moment, to get some of this work done. So it's not as if we're waiting for dollar number one to get on with doing this once we've prioritized. But I think we have to find the rest of it, and I think, again, the first logical step we take is what's in the recommendations, which is bring about a coordination of all the different budgets that have monies in them, water and TRCA and parks and forestry and recreation, and on the list goes. And even when I was being briefed, I really didn't know where I ended up in the briefing at the end of it in terms of who had how much money for this, because it's spread all over the place. And so I think that one of the things you'll see that I'm trying to do as the leader of the council and as the mayor is to see projects like this start with the notion that you prioritize and that you put together budgets that are often spread across 8 different places into at least one understandable spreadsheet, so we know how much we have to work with, how much more we have to get, and what we're going to do with it. The next thing I want to just mention is, and it fits within that, although we can't rely on them alone. I want to say that up front because people, again, get suspicious and start wringing their hands. I think this idea of the partnership with the Ravine leaders is fabulous. I think the more we can engage people, foundations, wealthy people, corporations, on acceptable terms to us, but engage them in something like this, which is, let's face it, a place where there's not going to be a lot of visible recognition for them. They're doing it because they believe it's the right thing to do for the city and for their children and grandchildren. I think it's fantastic. When I hear the amounts, it makes me want to weep that they've attracted to places like Millennium Park and the Central Park Conservancy hundreds of millions of dollars from people who say, yeah, there's something I really want to help with my money, because it's about the future and it's about the sort of very soul of this city. It's about its connected arteries. It's about a part of its natural history. So to me, the Ravine leaders, part of the recommendation is crucial, but not alone. I mean, obviously the government has to be there as the first partner. and the foremost partner, because there are some aspects to this that nobody outside of government will do. And a lot of the private sector philanthropists have told me they won't be there if they think that it's an excuse for not doing government funding. In other words, they expect us to step up and they will support us. And then finally, I will just say that the last thing to mention is that the implementation plan that's called for in this report is coming to us in 2018, not 2023 or 2025, 2018. And my view will be to pass it after we've discussed it and to get on with it. And I want to just say in that spirit, I will be supporting both Councillor Wong Tam's motion. I'm particularly attracted to the second paragraph, which deals with the maintenance of it, because I think that's a failing we have now, where we have the ravines already and we're not properly maintaining them, and if that costs us some money to do it, better. And I don't quite fully understand the implications of all of what Councillor de Beermaker's motion does, but I think to know what's there in terms of biological inventory is sensible. So I will support those motions. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Now, before we vote, and Councillor Perruzza, I want to thank you very much for moving a motion in my ward, but I'm going to have to rule it out of order because this is transportation, and actually this work, we're doing the work. It was approved a few years ago, and a lot of it's private property, so the city staff is part of the report, so this motion is redundant. So thank you very much. Okay, I'm moving this out of order. No, do you want to challenge me? Do you want to challenge me?
Did you hear how she said that? I was saying no.
No, I know, Councillor Perruzza, but I appreciate it, but it's being done.
It's not my intention to challenge you.
Okay.
Well, not so, Speaker, because I asked our staff those questions.
No, Councillor Perruzza, I'm really not out of order, so all you can do is challenge me or move on. Okay. Okay, thank you. So, we'll vote on the motions. Motion 1 by Councillor Wong Tam. It's on the screen.
You know that's not true, right?
All in favor? Carried. Motion 2 by Councillor de Beermaker. Recorded vote.
Councillor Perruzza, please. Councillor Carmichael Greb, please.
Councillor Cole, when you're seated, please.
Councillor Matlow, your vote, please.
The motion carries 38-3.
Item as amended. Recorded vote.
Councillor Palacio and Councillor Cole, please.
Councillor Matlow, please.
The item as amended carries unanimously 42 in favor.
Our next item, which is page 6, the mayor's key item, which is EX 27.15, creating 600 affordable rental homes at the West Downlands and 27 Grosvenor and 25 Grenville sites, wards 27 and 28. Do we have questions? No? Speakers? Okay. Councillor Fletcher, you have questions?
Yeah, I just have a question about, there seems to be some confusion about how fast and easy it is to build affordable housing, Madam Speaker. So I just have to understand that we're allocating dollars, that's part of our affordable housing plan, and then there are permissions that are required. And I'm not sure who right over here. So I just want to be very clear, because I believe there's a little confusion in people's minds that when we vote and say, here's this many million for X, that somehow that it's either shovel ready or all the approvals have happened. Can you just explain that what the sequencing is for an affordable housing in the city, please, Mr. Gatt?
Thank you very much, Councillor, for the question. Through the chair, the item before you is related to the provincial lands program, and the Ontario government is going out with a call, and has gone out to the call, to the nonprofit and private housing sectors to develop these lands, which were first set aside in 1989.
Sorry.
And with a call that 30% of the units to be developed be affordable, with the remainder being purpose-built rental housing. This is the beginning of the process, but to create certainty for the nonprofit and private sector organizations that will build here, the city is doing something unusual, but a good thing is being recommended, that you pre-approve what the city's incentives are, so that in bringing forward a business plan for the development, these units will go forward. This is the beginning of the process. We would expect that there would be shovels in the ground within about a year and a half.
So we're pre-approving the incentives, so we would have two tracks running beside one another, not wait and then have to give the incentives later.
That's correct, Councillor. At some point in the process, you have to agree and approve that you want affordable housing to create it. And this is actually, if you will, giving birth to that.
But one of the things is, and then obviously there is a development proposal of some kind. Has that been approved yet, or that's still being approved?
The development proposal will be brought forward by the successful organization.
So just to be clear, we're pre-approving some incentives, and then somebody's going to be win that, awarded that contract, and then there will be a development proposal that will have to be submitted and go through whatever is required there, at least site plan for sure, or if it needs any variations in the Planning Act, and then, only then, will there actually be something built.
That's correct, Councillor. I will say, though, in the partnership with the Ontario government has specified specifically what the built form will be for that community in the West Don Lands, such that it will essentially be required to be in compliance with the precinct plan that Council's already approved.
So we've pre-approved that, but there's still some permissions that would be required, and building permits and everything else in order to actually erect the building. So
that's correct.
If people, do you think that we need to be clearer when we're saying we're pre-approving this, that we're at the very beginning of a process, not we're at the end of a process and those units are already in place? Because there does seem to be some confusion in the public about that.
Well, I think it's very important, Councillor, that, and what you have in front of you today is what I would refer to as a pipeline project. It has to start somewhere. It starts here before someone can actually put a key in a door.
So from 1989 until 2017, that's not been acted on, and now we will, within a year and a half, given if we approve this, actually have some housing.
That's correct.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Wong-Tam.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Through you to staff, regarding the affordability period for the properties that are in of interest today, can you explain to us the limitation that's fixed by date? So, for example, West Don Lands, the affordability period is 49 years. The Grosvenor Grenville site, it's 40 years. What happens after on the 50th year and the 41st year.
When the affordability period ends, like the 50th year.
Right. Councillor, the affordability period is established based on the incentives available. In the West Donlands in particular, it has been determined because of it being a large site through the city's large sites policy that that housing was required to be affordable in perpetuity. And so that's why the province of Ontario, according to the city's large sites policy, has done that. In the case of the Grenville Grosvenor site, the affordability is 40 years. But as you are aware, the province of Ontario has now extended rent controls on all rental housing, which means then that a person who would be in a unit in 40 years from now, as long as they're there, that housing would continue to be covered by rent control and affordable for them. So it, in fact, could be affordable for 50 or 60 years.
But it's not in perpetuity when it comes to Grenville Grosvenor.
That's correct. And the distinction, though, because the large sites policy governs the West Don Lands properties.
And in the absence of the large site policy, which doesn't apply to Grenville Grosvenor, and it won't apply to a large number of downtown potential sites for affordable housing, then the very best we can do has a time expiration to it. So in this case, it's 40 years plus a day, maybe 50 years with rent control. But I know that there have been other sites where we've been able to capture maybe 20 years of affordability, or perhaps 10 years of mid-range affordability, which is not really affordable at all. So what can we do to deepen that policy so it does become affordable housing in perpetuity?
For a longer period?
For a longer period, correct.
So typically it would be to give up more value associated with the land. As you are aware, the province of Ontario will be taking less than market value on the Grenville Grosvenor site. And one option as well, and what is being done in the West Don Lands, is the land, rather than being sold, is being leased for 50 years initially, so that the buildings and the land ultimately return to the province of Ontario.
So in the case of Grenville Grosvenor, just hypothetically, the land will be conveyed. So the deed is going to be transferred for a nonprofit developer. But it sounds to me there's only 30% of that housing that will be affordable housing for a limited period of time. 70% is going to be market valued driven housing, correct? Is it not possible for the province to also consider a long land lease in this case as well? So we can capture that affordability for a much longer period of time?
Okay, so Councillor, let me just take you back a moment if I could. This site about a year and a half was on the private market, and the Ontario government was selling it for a condominium. Through advocacy that was done by yourself as well as the mayor and other members of council, the province of Ontario has had a change of mind. In their fair housing plan this spring, they took this site out of a market process and have put it forward to be entirely a purpose-built rental housing building, with 30% of the units to be affordable, 1, 2, and 3-bedroom units. And that's essentially where we've come in terms of, if you will, the best-case scenario. Could we have done better? Perhaps. But relatively speaking, this is a big win to get a purpose-built rental housing building with 30% affordable in downtown Toronto.
Recognizing that there was advocacy effort from my office, from your office, to sort of get a bigger win, what could we have done differently? Because it's,
I think one
30%.
of the things we're looking at, Councillor, is a number of different models where land leases occur, as well as sales, and to see whether we can essentially come up with a best practice. Typically, though, the sites have all their own unique characteristics, their own market values, and we also have to be sensitive as to what can be built. So it's sort of a combination of factors that makes a kind of recommendation as to whether it's a sale or a lease. In this case, the province of Ontario decided to proceed with a sale.
Thank you. Councillor DeGiorgio.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Mr. Gadden, I think I've got some of the answers that I was looking for, but I just want you to clarify for me. You mentioned that we're looking at 2,000 units, 30% of which are affordable, and then the rest are market units, correct? 1,400 would be market units.
That's correct.
Okay, so in the context of the affordability guidelines that the city has, as opposed to affordability at the provincial level, 600 of those units, as I understand it, will have affordable rents. But the question I have is, will those rents be up to 1 times the CMHC averages, equal to 1 time, less than 1 time? In other words, will there be social housing units there, or are they just essentially rental units with rents at the 1 time CMHC averages?
Thank you for that question, Councillor. We've gone to a fair amount of planning with the province of Ontario to make sure that within the building that we have different affordable rates, some at the CMHC average, but also some at 80% of the CMHC average, and some even down at 40% of the CMHC average. So you're actually getting a mix of residents within the affordable categories.
Okay. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Campbell?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Just who will be developing the housing?
So the province of Ontario, Councillor, currently has a proposal call or an offering for eligible organizations that have the ability to construct and operate at these locations. So that is a decision that will be made by the province of Ontario in the coming months.
And so will that be a for-profit provider that then provides 30% affordable rates, or will it be a not-for-profit provider?
The province of Ontario describes themselves as being agnostic as to whether the group that is chosen is private or nonprofit. What they're looking for is a great project, and a project that an organization is able to both design, develop, and operate. So they're basically looking for, if you will, the best proponent possible, regardless of whether it's nonprofit or private.
So I think it matters, because if it's a not-for-profit provider that's building it, I would think that the affordable units would provide better value than if it's a for-profit provider. Is that not a fair assumption? Because if somebody comes in and they're a for-profit provider and they have to make their money on 1,400 units, something has got to give, I would think, at the back end for the other affordable units. Is that, or are these all standardized units, or is, what can you talk about that?
No, Councillor, basically 70% of the units in the project will allow, if you will, the developer or the nonprofit or private sector, if they wish, to use to offset whatever risk they may be taking in offering the affordable rents over the long periods that are being contracted.
So how were these numbers arrived at? Fees and charges, and it's over 49 years. Did we do an estimation on how property taxes were going to rise over the next 40 years, and then they're given a certain amount of forgiveness?
Actually, Councillor, we have a formula that the Finance Department has developed that gives you the net present value, and you capitalize that.
Confidence in those numbers, Mr. Ravine?
So through you, Madam Speaker, we take the life of what the affordability period is. We make assumptions on property taxes, on the development charges that we forgive, plus the waiving of the building permit fees and planning fees, and then we extrapolate that out and then do a net present value and bring it back, and that's the number, the values that you see on page 3.
So we're waiving all property values, is that correct, or a portion thereof?
Just the affordable.
No, it's just on the affordable units.
Only on the affordable.
Where we waive.
So they still pay it on the affordable, on the market. They still pay it.
Oh, absolutely. Right. Yes, of course. They pay everything: the building permit fees, planning fees, development charges, and property taxes.
Okay. All right. Okay. And so how do we know that this is a great deal from a money standpoint? Like, in other words, we're getting as many, you had said you had confidence in the number. How do we know that we're getting, as many units, as Councillor Wong Tam pointed out, for as many years as possible?
Okay, Councillor, just in terms of the cost to develop affordable housing in the city, we know that this is a good proposition, value for money. At the same time, this is housing that otherwise wouldn't have been created.
Right. Okay. All right. Okay, that's my questions, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Councillor Carroll.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I just wanted to refresh my memory as to the open door housing program to begin with. Maybe Mr. Guyton can refresh my memory, because I'm hearing questions. There's a disappointment that this is affordable rental units, but that is actually what the open door program actually wanted, is it not? We're getting what we wanted, because is the principle not that that if we start to include affordable, we eventually are freeing up what is the actual rent geared to income capacity that we already have. We're keeping people from having to join the social housing list, and we're moving some people who could move from market value in social housing to an affordable rent situation. Was that not our goal to begin with?
Councillor, you're correct on that front. When we presented the Open Door program to Council in December of about a year and a half ago,
right.
This is what Council approved, and I brought in front of Council at the time what the income levels of a family that would move into an affordable official plan defined unit in the city, and on average you're looking at an income of no more than $40,000.
Right.
That's what we're talking about. That's the affordable rate. Below that, we're using every other mechanism available to us currently to get lower rents, including capital subsidies, rent supplements, housing allowances, and possibly even federally through what might be a new housing benefit plan coming through the National Housing Strategy. But there's only so much we can do to get those rents down to a point where they're more affordable. But right now, the upper limit on that affordable rent, official plan defined, is an income of no more than $40,000.
Right. And if we were to, which could be indexed at some point or another, but that's the base we're starting from. And this is also at a ratio of 70% market value to achieving 30%. If we were to do this through zoning and requirement, through our vision of inclusionary zoning, we'd still be looking at similar ratios. Am I right in that?
Well, it's kind of a hypothetical question as to what inclusionary zoning may or may not bring, but yeah. I can assure you that we've not been talking about affordable housing rates that would give you 30%. Right.
That would have been the gold standard if it was even achievable. So this is an outstanding ratio at 70 to 30. This is not just sprinkling in a half a dozen units. 70% to 30% is actually an excellent achievement. Would you not say?
I would agree, Councillor. And what is interesting, I could say as well, in addition, is that the industry is responding as well and being prepared to do it at that rate, which was actually quite significant.
Exactly. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Councillor Bailao.
Thank you. Through you, Madam Speaker, to the Chief Planner. Can you tell us from a zoning perspective to occupancy, what is the time frame that it takes to get a unit built in the city?
So from a planning perspective, depending on what approvals are needed, a more complex application, if it needed zoning approvals, subdivision approvals, site plan approval, could be 9 to 18 months, depending on the complexity of the process and the site. Then you have to move into a detailed design phase, tendering phase, and construction. You've got 4 to 5 years probably from very beginning to very end.
So 4 to 5 years. So when, for example, we talk about inclusionary zoning building us 2,000 units, it would take 4 to 5 years to have those units actually being occupied.
Depending on the complexity of the site,
Great.
Yes.
But the policy, the place where you can actually affect the change, where you can actually create the change, for example, through inclusionary zoning is at the zoning process, so it's fair that you count those units at that process, at that phase, correct?
That's correct.
Correct. So let's turn to this program that we have, and I think I heard correct that you're hoping to actually get shovels in the ground in a year and a half. Is that correct?
With respect to the West Dawnlands
Yep.
project, yes.
Is that a result of the process that we took and the fast track and the planning that we took and getting planned and involved in the preliminary phases of the discussions of this project as well?
I would say that that's contributing to that, absolutely.
Okay. And the reason why you're counting this project as part of the open door is because you're actually allocating $27 million of financial incentives towards this project. So you actually have to account for that money. So you have to count these units this year as they're getting approved towards our target. Is that correct?
That's correct, Councillor.
So we are actually counting these units because this council meeting will be approving $27 million of incentives at a phase that actually we need to create some certainty as people are putting together their performance, as people are conceptualizing this project, where you can actually affect the change and create the affordable housing. You're giving that certainty to the sector, but at the same time, we as a city have to account for them so we don't award this money to anybody else.
Councillor, what is before you is essentially essential to the business proposition of building and constructing affordable housing, and that's why it's there now, to create that certainty that you've spoken of.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Shiner?
I guess my question is of the acting chief planner, Mr. Lintern. And then I'm going to ask a similar question of Mr. Gadden. There was an article in the paper, somewhat critical, of the way that we're dealing with the affordable housing in the city and getting development approvals. Basically, it's saying you're talking, but you're not doing. And I think we're doing a lot more than we are talking about it, because I stand up at every meeting, and although I give out the numbers over here, the programs in front of us I think are absolutely terrific. So when it comes to processing an application for affordable housing, can you just give me a brief outline of what you're doing now and if you are trying to expedite those?
Well, through you, Madam Chair, with respect to the matters before Council, both in this report and in the other item at Executive Committee, which outlines the status of the planning approvals associated with each of those projects, what we're trying to do in coordination with Mr. Gadden's unit is to develop our position on the planning parameters of those sites in advance, working with the proponents of those projects, getting as much of that legwork done in advance so that when they come in to actually file their applications, everybody's got a very clear expectation of what is in the realm of possibility. And then, of course, we take it through the planning approval process and coordinate it with our other divisions to get all the technical requirements and get it back to City Council for approval as quickly as possible.
So the bottom line is it takes ourselves as the ones responsible for giving the planning approvals and those which are putting forward the projects to work cooperatively and responsively as quickly as they can together to get these projects moving?
Yes, and I think the extra effort here is about the work that's done before the applications are made. So, for example, on Grenville-Grosvenor, we've already had some good work done on what the built form parameters might be supportable for that site, and that information gets conveyed to the marketplace so that the marketplace has a good idea of what is supportable and what isn't. And then going forward, that prevents the endless loops that can sometimes occur when a proposal is made that is not in keeping with a planning framework that's supportable.
So, Mr. Gadden, I guess similar question, because we're dealing now with these properties in particular that are the 600 affordable rental housing units. Are we working in advance, and does your office and city planning coordinate well to try and get these proposals moving? And in this case, how are we going to be moving forward with this particular
item, the 600 affordable housing rental homes.
Councillor, to your point, in advance, the Planning Department and my office have worked with Infrastructure Ontario. Infrastructure Ontario is responsible for putting out the call for these lands, and we've essentially given them the criteria that will apply for that project. So I would say that the coordination, frankly, at this point is unprecedented.
And what about the rest of the affordable housing units, whether they be rental or ownership units in the last 2 or 3 years? Is the same type of cooperation in place on those applications?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, speakers. Councillor Wong Tam, the only speaker? Okay. Councillor Wong Tam?
I certainly hope not, considering
Well,
this
your name
topic.
is the only one that's up there.
Okay, thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I want to thank staff for putting together the report, and I want to just also, sort of explain my line of questioning, because I don't want it I don't want it to sound like I'm disparaging staff in any way, because I recognize how hard they work, especially Sean Gadden and his crew of one more, to try to advance and to put affordable housing, whether it's home ownership or rental, on the agenda for us. And I know that the tools are limited. I know they work so hard. They push as far as they can in every single direction. When there's an opportunity, Sean is ready to pounce on it. And so is Councillor Bailao and Mayor Tory. I think what I wanted to express is, at least at this point in time, a level of frustration. And I know it's important for us to applaud the good work when it's done, and certainly we should. But at the same time, recognize that this was just one incremental move. And the incremental move, of course, is the fact that the West Don land had already been earmarked for affordable housing. It's good that we get to announce it again. But with respect to Grenville and Grosvenor, which is the morgue lands, as you will recognize them, in Ward 27, so that's my community, for 4.5 years I've been working with Sean and Councillor Bailao on trying to make sure that that particular parcel of land that was right in the heart of the city, is that we knew that the province had intentions to dispose of it. And the province had already indicated that they wanted to sell it, and they wanted to do so by severing the land. And so the background story here is that it wasn't necessarily an easy move to go forward and say now 30% is going to be affordable housing. That was 4.5 years of advocacy where I've written letters to several different ministers of housing and municipal affairs at the province, letting them know that my community, just south of the University of Toronto lands, just off of Bay Street, is that we were very interested in taking that asset, that provincial asset, and turning it into affordable housing. And we were welcoming affordable housing in this neighborhood. And even with the intention of wanting to do that, it was quiet for a very, very, very long time. So of course I'm going to be more than welcoming of this announcement, but it should be noted is that it didn't come necessarily easily for the province. We basically had to chip away and raise our hand and said, before you dispose, think twice. You have an opportunity to do something really great, and you have to meet the provincial objectives, and you want the city to meet our objectives of trying to build housing. So yes, I'm going to celebrate this victory, because I'm going to take every moment we can. But we could have perhaps done a little bit better. And I think that the fact that this policy allows us to build housing and earmark it for 40 years, and hopefully the rent control programs are going to be in place when the 40-year plus 1 day kicks in, so we can maybe extend it for another 50 years. This is a government asset that at some point in time may no longer be affordable housing. And so I just wanted to sort of highlight the fact that it is very, very difficult, as we all know, Madam Speaker, in the chambers, to advocate for affordable housing. And we have to get the orders of government to work together better. It should not have taken 4.5 years for us to get to this point, but it did. So I'd like us to think that, moving forward to the next few phases, and there are other assets, both provincially, federally, and municipally, that will be on the floor for consideration as surplus land and disposal for market value. We have to do better by ourselves and with the other orders of government. 15 Wellesley is a parking lot owned by the Toronto Parking Authority. And they're in the same process right now about thinking about what are they going to do with that site. Of course, they want to declare it as surplus. We've had numerous conversations about what are they going to do with that site directly across from Wellesley subway station. And at every single meeting, I brought up affordable housing, and at every single meeting, they come back and it's not on the table. So I don't know what it will take in order for us to make sure that when the city disposes its own assets, we actually live by the policies that we're trying to develop to make sure that whatever we do with our own assets, we're going to meet those city objectives that we've already set. If we said there's a housing crisis, then we have to meet the needs.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Shiner.
Madam Speaker, I rise very much in support of the initiative that's here, the creation of the 600 affordable housing units on the provincial land, and very much to speak in the support of all of our staff, both in our housing office and in our planning office, that have taken the direction over the last 3 years that this council has given under this mayor to really make housing and affordable housing a priority. It is something, I mean, as I said, I stand up at the beginning of the meetings and speak about the number of units that we've been able to accomplish through the recent approvals through council, but it really has been a change in direction. It is something that this city has needed, and it's something that's moving forward, and it's something that I think more credit should be given. You can't talk about an approval of a site for affordable housing on 1 month and expect that a month or 2 months or 3 months or even 6 months later you're going to have a shovel in the ground. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way with any development application anywhere. You have to take it, you have to put out what you would like to see, you have to get your partners involved, you have to get the plans approved that work, and you have to get the finance behind it, then you have to get your site plans in place, and then you have to actually go to construction. And when I read an article, as I did, being critical of what's been happening, I don't think that's fair. I don't think that's fair at all, because this council, this term, has done more to try and deal with the issue of the inability for people to afford houses in the city than has been done before. Absolutely, there's a lot farther we can go, and absolutely, every one of us can look at every application in our own wards and say, why isn't there 10 or 20% affordable housing coming out of that? Why aren't we using up all the funding that's available so our housing office is saying, I'm out of money, I don't have any more, which he's not at yet, and they're not at yet. That's where you want to be. And you want to be going back when you're giving extra density on a site to try and convince those that are asking for it in their applications to try and help make some housing affordable in the city. So this is a case, in my opinion, where there was a mistake made on the old LCBO site in the waterfront. No affordable housing and a lot of density. The province realizing that that might have not been the best thing to do, and coming around to saying, now we're going to work with you. 30% of these lands now are going to be affordable housing. That is a credit to this council, to the leadership that this council has given in continually promoting the fact that there aren't enough affordable housing in the city by pushing the issue through Councillor Ballo, through the mayor, through all of you that have development applications saying something has to be done and getting it onto the agenda. So instead of being critical of it, we should be relishing the fact that it is on the agenda, that it is being talked about, and that we are delivering as a city much more than has ever been delivered before, and more than you'll find in any other part of the GTA. So I'm proud of it. I'm very supportive of the item that's in front of us. I think it's a great way to move forward. I think it's using the example that we've already given ourselves when we go out and work with housing, that we've given through Build Toronto, that we've given in our partnerships, and I think we should just continue to do this and more. Thank you. And Tippett, which my colleague keeps reminding me here, and Councillor Pasternak's ward, is a wonderful example of 200 affordable housing units that are coming out of a formerly city-owned piece of property, which he was only so glad to see it no longer be a parking lot for commuters, and just loves the fact that it's affordable housing. Thank you.
It's not being built on the parking lot.
Thank you. Councillor Fletcher to speak.
Yes, thank you, Speaker. I was at the fantastic announcement in the West Don lands of the new affordable housing units there, because, of course, our dear Councillor McConnell could not be there. And we do know that, boy, was she ever a champion for affordable housing, a champion to rebuild Regent Park, a champion to ensure that in West Don lands we had as much affordable housing as possible. And it was very sad that she was not able to be there for this new step and stage for this very strategic piece of property right on the streetcar line, just up from the Portlands. A very exciting announcement. And when Mr. Gadden said that that piece of property has been sitting in that way for 28 years, 28 years, 1989, oh, okay, Councillor Bearmaker says just go for 30 years. 38. Oh.
Going once? No, wait, no, it's not 38.
It's 28. Thank you. You're not on the Budget Committee, and if you are, I'm sorry, we'll have to have you removed. Anyway, so that's quite an accomplishment to bring what would be called, if it was agricultural, a fallow piece of land, but one just sitting, just waiting, and finally brought in to the affordable housing family. I really appreciate what Councillor Shiner said, that I don't think it was a fair assessment. Well, you passed all these 1,000 units. Why aren't they built yesterday? Why aren't they built today? Why aren't they just built next year? Anyone, if we look at all our development applications that we approve at all of our community councils, there's a start, there's a long process before that shovel gets in the ground and before whatever it is gets actually built. And in this case, we have to allocate the finances. That always happens up front. Nobody's going to start a development if they don't know that they have the money. Who's going to be able to hire an architect, hire a development consultant, look at the soil situation, do all that has to be done, find the contractor if they don't know that they're going to be funded? If that is just so fundamental to building something. So it's really is surprising to me that there is this approach that this is very facile, very easy to do. Okay, we're going to build that. Where is it? So we need to have people understand that development process. Need the money, need the plan, and do the work. It has been, I'm just going to go over, earlier Councillor Bearmaker was talking about he's been here for 14 years. Is it 24 or 14? Oh, 38 years. So that during that time, I have watched a lot happen on the housing file. And it was under David Miller that Councillor Mamalidi actually headed up a task force called HOT, Housing Opportunities for Toronto, where we got back into the affordable housing business. We got back into the business in a way where at times we'd had organizations that didn't have a lot of capacity and they were awarded contracts and they would languish or they'd be in trouble. We have now a very sophisticated system for awarding affordable housing. You have to have the capacity, you have to be able to do it, the pre-approvals are there, and it is actually a time when we're able to accomplish what we set out to do, which is build affordable housing. We have all of the Portlands coming. We have to make sure that we have a wide range of affordable housing there, colleagues, not just low end of market. but also rent geared to income on those lands. We have a new real estate approach, which I hope would overcome what Councillor Wong-Tam's speaking about, where the parking authority isn't sure that they want to blend in and have affordable housing. Because if you remember the early days of Build Toronto and all the sites that were sold, there wasn't one affordable housing unit in the early days of Build Toronto that were built into those sales that we made of those strategic properties. So I just want to say at this point, housing is in. It's in all of our real estate. It's in Build Toronto. It's in our planning. It's in our Affordable Housing Office, and I think we're in a very good position. So I just want to congratulate all those, the Mayor, Councillor Bailau, the staff, for just not giving up. Don't let anybody tell you it can't be done.
Thank you. Councillor Layton.
Yes, thank you very much. Despite our Chair of Planning and Growth's warning not to be critical of our affordable housing policy, I'm going to make one exception, not be critical at what the city has been doing this past term, because I did support the program as it came through, but critical of the province for limiting the toolbox that we have. Our friends at the Star have just quoted me from a previous discussion. We have a crappy toolbox for how to do this. We have endorsed and asked the province to give us more powers to use inclusionary zoning clauses, to come up with better ways of increasing the amount of affordable housing in each and every development, rather than us scrambling together and stacking programs and pulling stuff out of Section 37 and out of our ears and from up our sleeves, just trying to hobble together one or two development proposals. We have come a long way, and much to the credit of the leadership of Build Toronto and perhaps the Mayor's office in what we've been able to accomplish from some of our city properties. I remember there was a time when Build Toronto came to me with the sale of 2 sites, and I said, how much affordable housing? And they said, none. And I said, well, weren't you supposed to build us all this affordable housing? And they said they had done 6 of 1,500 units, 12 of 1,500 units to that point. They'd had like 4 years to come up with that and hadn't done a damn thing. So in this, when the next proposal came to my desk that Build came up, my first phone call was to Sean Gadden to say, hey, Sean, you got an opportunity here. They got to build you these units. So they came back with 25. Oh, boy. There was, in that whole development proposal of about 1,200 units, 25 affordable ones. The city owned the land. We approved 5 buildings on it, and that's all we could scrape together. Now, in that case, at least we got something. But unless the province moves on this inclusionary zoning, every day that goes by, every planning application that comes through that door at city planning is a loss of potential affordable housing units to the city of Toronto. And in the decade that the city's asked for this power, we could have been building thousands of units. I don't have the number because our acting chief planner didn't have it off the top of his head. But I know that this number exists, and I know it's in the many thousands of units that would have been created in the past decade in multi-unit residential housing had we had the power and the regulatory authority to use inclusionary zoning as a means for achieving our affordable housing goals. So it's not at the city's fault that we're doing such a poor job at building affordable housing. It is in fact rests in the hands of the provincial government, who have not given us the tools to properly zone them in all new development. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's died 3 times. Right?
Thank you. Councillor Pertz.
Thank you, Speaker. I want to begin by absolutely making it clear that the work of the Affordable Housing Office, that the work of the Chair of the Affordable Housing Committee, and the work of the Mayor have been outstanding. They have been outstanding. The fact that we're doing anything at all, Mr. Mayor, your work has been outstanding. But within but that outstanding work takes place within a set of parameters. It takes place within a set of parameters where we set a yardstick 9 years ago, I believe, of 1,000 units a year. And the fact that we're finally close to that, or maybe even a little bit over, is an achievement. But it's not the achievement we need. I was at a meeting in Parkdale with a group of 50 tenants who live at a variety of addresses who are losing their homes, largely through legal means, although in one instance through an illegal eviction. And when you say to them, you know, we have this policy around rental retention, and we you know, I put Section 37 agreements in on any development application in my ward that's big enough, and there's a problem there. Most of the mid-rise isn't big enough to generate Section 37, so you can't put affordable housing in. When you say to them, well, you know, we're trying, they just say, you do understand that I have two choices now. I can leave Toronto or live on the street. And they're not exaggerating. They're not exaggerating at all. We are losing deeply affordable units faster than we're building them in the City of Toronto. And I see Mr. Gadden nodding his head. So I put it to this council, maybe not today when we're considering the great work we've done within the confines of the world that we operate in. Maybe today we celebrate, but by the end of this term, we need a better yardstick. Simply having a number of units that we provide incentives for, or that we build, or that we get federal money for, that's not a good enough yardstick. Our official plan states quite clearly that every neighborhood in the City of Toronto should be able to provide housing and services to people across a mix of income. And we are not achieving that. And I think now that we've got, you know, open door and some federal money and some provincial money, it's time for us as a council to step back and say, how do we devise policy and financial planning that gets us to what the official plan describes, to the vision that I believe we all share, which are truly inclusive neighborhoods. Neighborhoods and also circumstances so that when someone is living in a unit and the owner decides to knock it down and there are fewer than 6 because that owner can make a whole lot of money putting in higher end units, there's somewhere for that person to go in the neighborhood. So yes, we've done outstanding work. Yes, Mr. Mayor, you've done outstanding work, but we need to do better than outstanding because there is a crisis. There's a crisis in supportive housing, there is a crisis in deeply affordable housing, and there's a crisis for the children of the middle class who will not get the same housing opportunities that I and my partner had when we got into the housing market 20 years ago. So take the win today, but let us commit as a council that we are going to revisit this and come up with new tools. We might have to lead, because I don't think what the federal and provincial government's offering is enough. But let's make our neighborhoods truly mixed income again. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Carroll.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, my colleague, Councillor Fletcher, spoke earlier already. She's already crossed off the list. But I want to thank her for a comment that she made back when the announcement was made. She already mentioned having been there at the announcement. And I was listening on the radio. I wasn't at the event, but in the radio coverage, a reporter asked Councillor Fletcher if this was good news and was she supportive of the mayor and Councillor Bailau. And she said, you know, we don't ask our residents often enough, but there is no question that you could go to any neighborhood in the City of Toronto, and in another crowded gymnasium, simply describe for a minute or two our crisis of affordability in housing on any level, in ownership, rental, or even the shortage of rent geared to income, and ask them, is that something with which you'd like to help? Do you want to help with that? Through my good offices, through what I can do in the council, do people really want to help those who are well housed and can afford their housing costs? And she said, I dare say that really anyone in that positive situation would say yes, and I think she's right. I went back to my own ward, having heard that, and began to ask that question in any gathering, and the answer is always yes. But when we get that opportunity We like to beat ourselves up because it's never fast enough. It is never enough money from each of the governments. We never give enough of our own money. We never can quite catch up with it. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't look at all of the different options and make sure that we are in fact making progress on all of these fronts. To me, the affordable level is the least understood. We know that anytime we're doing a social housing revitalization or we're trying to fit rent geared to income through supplements into buildings, it can be controversial. We know that, and we've gotten very good as a body, as a council, of weathering that and mitigating that and making a little bit of progress. But if this affordable, and we heard Mr. Gadden outline it, Councillor DeGiorgio did us the favor of asking on the air for any folks watching, what does that mean? And yes, it can mean average, but it can also mean at 80% of average and another ratio below that. And those are, in some respects, the most important people to serve as quickly as we can. If it takes 4 years to build this building, so be it. In my own immediate family, I have people that are underhoused in all 3 generations. In my own generation, a sibling, a child, a grandchild, they're all underhoused. And that's not unusual. I'm not unique in this room. I know it. I know each of us can think of someone very close to us who in this city is currently underhoused. Whether they've had to move in with someone else, whether they've got kids and they're living in a basement or sleeping on a sofa in a living room, it's a crisis. The affordability measure allows us to help those who are so close to slipping into the hardest part of that crisis, to keep them feeling like they really are of worth. They really are, despite the fact that they may be fully employed, they may still only be bringing home $40,000. They're the people who work all around us, the people in the health sector surrounding this building, people in this very building who may have families and still they're doing a job that we can afford to pay them $40,000 a year for, not $60,000, not $70,000, not $90,000. But they need to be housed. And we expect them to continue to feed this city with growth, to establish families and carry on. And we don't want them all to end up in social housing. So it's important that we actually designate and make sure that this affordable niche continues on in both ownership and rental. Now, I'll just say, Madam Speaker, briefly, I asked about inclusionary zoning. Inclusionary zoning will allow us to do something if we ever get it. But I'm negotiating something that's coming to Community Council this very next round. And what that means is in a building of 400 units, I'm going to get eight affordable ownership units. Not 70% to 30%, with the help of intergovernmental funding. If we're leaving it all to zoning, you're never going to get to 70%, 30%.
Thank
Heard Mr.
you.
Gadden say so.
Thank you, Councillor Carroll.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Councillor Bailao.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to start by thanking staff, both planning staff and the Affordable Housing Office, because I know they did an incredible amount of work these last few months to have this report here in front of us. Even though that, like staff said, this land had been allocated for affordable housing back in '89 or whatever it was, the reality is that only a few months ago we got confirmation both on the Grosvenor site and like Councillor Wong Tam said, a lot of advocacy had been done in there, and the West Don lands where also a lot of advocacy and legislation had been passed in there. I also want to thank a lot of the councillors that continuously push for affordable housing in this chamber. And I often say that I know that we've never done as much as a council in all kinds of files, from shelter to TCHC to affordable housing, but the reality is as well that the need has never been this great as well. I think Councillor Perks was right on. We're doing a lot, but the need keeps growing at a much, much faster pace. And that is why when we have a perfect example of what is to bring different orders of government together, the private sector, the nonprofit sector, when we have a success story in front of us, we should celebrate, and we should say to all these partners, we can do this. Only when we come together, we can do this. We can develop 600 units. We can have the 70-30 ratio because it works. We've proven that it works. And that's what we're doing in here. And that's why sometimes some of you get a little bit surprised when what is supposed to be a good story, people try to put it in a bad story. Nobody's saying that the work is done. Far from it. Far from it. That is why we're actually working to start the next hot plan, because we know that we've barely accomplished this one, and we have to have a lot of work, a lot of conversations with the sector, with Torontonians, to create the next 10-year housing plan with all that Councillor Perks said, by challenging us, by challenging all these definitions, and we're going to start doing that at the beginning of next year. But for the first time, at least we've built a pipeline that will develop over 1,000 units. And that came through allocating the funds to creating the policies that actually are going to translate in the units. And some of those units might be in a few months, some of those units might be in a year or two. But if we don't create the policy
Councillor
that will
Bailo, I'm
affect
just going to
change...
stop your time for a second. Councillor Bailo, as chair of the committee, I'm going to ask that the chamber be a little more respectful of... We're getting down to the end of the speakers list. I'm having trouble hearing the chair of the committee that actually brought the item to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Like I was saying, we actually created the policy to interfere at the point that can actually have an impact and translate these units into reality. That's what we're having in front of us. There's going to be $27 million that we're going to be committing to this project. And by bringing together our share with the province, with the development industry that will be developing this, or nonprofit sector, we're going to be able to translate this into 600 units. We need many, many more stories like this. We need many, many more of this, the advocacy that went into this work. We need many, many more of these incentives, because that's the only way we're going to move the ball forward. And I'm happy to be able to have your approval, the council's approval, to translate these 600 homes eventually into somebody's home.
Thank you, Councillor Bailão. If that is the last of the councillor speakers, Mayor Tory is the last speaker on the item. There are no other speakers. Thank you. Mayor Tory.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. First of all, could I just begin? There's been a lot of people who I think quite correctly said, as we've gone through this I think very constructive debate, that they, were working at this a long time ago in some cases, and that includes Councillor Wong-Tam, and it includes our staff, some of whom sound like they were working on it, and they were in the prior century. Certainly Councillor Bailão in her time here has been a relentless advocate on all this, and I just want to say thank you, because the fact is you don't get to these places without a lot of that hard work and without a lot of the frustration that I think all of us feel sometimes with the way the government process works generally, which is that in order to get these kinds of things done, you have to have the support of at least 2 or sometimes 3 governments, and that isn't always possible, and that certainly was true in this case. And I want to say the same is true of BUILD. I mean, BUILD and Councillor Shiner had a lot to do with this. I'm the first to say so. He went over there as the chair. He was already there, I think, and he became the chair. And he noted correctly that during its first number of years, basically all it did was sell land and give us money. And I guess that was fine. We needed the money. But in the end, it had also committed itself, and right in its original mandate were some provisions that said they were to produce a certain number of affordable housing units per year, and the number they were producing was goose egg, 0. And they're now producing quite literally hundreds of affordable housing units over a period of time. And so, we're making progress. And I guess I find this kind of bogus hair splitting that's gone on in some of the media, just that, bogus hair splitting. And I think maybe that point is driven home when you have across this chamber Councillor Shiner and Councillor Fletcher and Councillor Perks and a number of others saying, look, actually, this does represent progress. And I'd be the first to stand up here and say it. I was teasing Councillor Perks about repeating his compliment to me, and Councillor Layton almost got there. He said perhaps the mayor's office had done something. He's just easing in. But I'll be the first to stand up here and give credit where credit is due, and it isn't about me, and it isn't about my efforts alone. It's been a team effort here where first of all, we made the commitment to actually do something. And the bogus hair splitting I'm talking about is whether you call it create or support or approve or fund, the bottom line is that you have to go in an orderly process, and Councillor Fletcher put this very well. You have to put out the incentive so people know what's in it, for them to be part of this. You then have to approve the allocation of the money so that anybody who's going to step up and compete for the right to build the affordable housing knows what's available. You have to do the funding. You have to reach out to have the competition and say who wants to come in and build the affordable housing. You then have to select somebody. You have to then have them do a design and a plan. We then have to approve that. And then it's built, and then it's occupied. And this is not a sort of 21-day process. And again, I'm not meaning to be critical of anybody, but if there was a huge pipeline of stuff that had started into that long series of steps that I just went through 5 years ago, then we would be here today saying, wow, it's fantastic, let's go cut the ribbon on some new affordable units for people. But there weren't. So that's fine. It's history. It doesn't matter. But the bottom line is we're now doing this together. The province has come to the table. I think that's because we as a council and as a city took a strong stand saying to the province, you have some land, you can put this up as we have done. And I think the first thing we did collectively was put up some of our own land, so we said do as we're doing, not as we're saying. And now I have repeated, as recently as this afternoon when I spoke to the media, a call on the federal government to do the same thing. I know they're looking at their land holdings, but looking at them and offering some of them up, as the province has done, are two entirely separate things. And so the bottom line is, I want to just take yes for an answer, that's all, without for a minute being complacent about this. And I actually endorse much of the comment made by Councillor Perks in terms of how, and by, I think it was Councillor Wong Tam, who talked about the fact we need more tools. And I'll be honest, if you go and look at my initial answer I gave probably 3 or 4 years ago on inclusionary zoning, it was a waffle that the International House of Pancakes would be proud of. And I now believe, having sat here and watched, and the private sector people, when you give them either the right stick or the right carrot or a little bit of combination of carrot and stick, they will do a great job building affordable housing for us. But I realize sometimes the carrot isn't enough, or we'd have to have a carrot so huge that we just wouldn't be able to do it, even with the help of the other governments. So there's got to be a bit of a stick. And so you'll find me, subject to the rules being fair to us, because frankly the first rules the province put forward were unfair to us, saying, yes, that is something we must do. We must have them get on with that, get going with that, so that we can in turn use that in a positive way to make sure that we can meet the challenge of affordable housing. And of course, it's huge, but I will finish on this note. If you take together the progress of the last 4 weeks, and I want to give credit again to Premier Kathleen Wynne and in particular to Housing Minister Peter Milchin, because when the Housing Minister changed, a lot seemed to change with that. And so we have in the last 2 weeks $90 million for supportive housing, which will help 2,000 people of the kind of the people that Councillor Perks and others here were talking about. And this just today, and the stuff we've done so far this year will help 1,000 people. And if we do that every year, year after year, and you can't underestimate my determination and Councillor Barlow's, and I know all of you, we will actually make a meaningful, but by no means enough, dent in all this, and we will have more to do. But at least we can carry on with the progress we're making. And I thank you for standing firm when we were standing in there, wanting this land to be put up that will allow this matter here to be brought today, and the tremendous and absolutely unstinting leadership of Councillor Barlow, who really does take this to heart, and Sean Gadden, who, among all the staff, is somebody who's been making his life's work out of this, and we appreciate that. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Well said.
Thank you. On the item, recorded vote.
Councillor Shiner and Councillor Pasternak, please. Councillor Wong Tam, please. And Deputy Mayor, when you're seated, please.
Councillor Palacio, please.
The item carries unanimously, 42 in favor.
Okay, thank you. Okay, members, we will now go to the top of the page, page 3, and we'll go back to July's council meeting. And on page 3, LS 20.1, Councillor Mihevik, you held the item down. Questions to staff? Questions? Councillor Hart.
Thank you, Speaker. Question to the Executive Director. On page 4 of your report, you have a list of animals that you get common complaints about, and I noticed chickens is the first on the list. Can you tell us what complaints you receive?
It's been so long I forgot which button to use. Through you, Madam Speaker, typically the hen or chicken related complaints have been around those that have gotten loose. Chickens on the run.
Another question for the Executive Director. In consultation with your animal services staff, can you tell me if you have any concerns about the backyard hens attracting rodents or coyotes?
So through you, Madam Speaker, certainly we are dealing with the issue of coyotes and coy wolves in the city, particularly in ravine areas. Any type of outdoor activity that would attract rodents or other wildlife is a concern.
Another question of you. I don't see the medical officer of health here, so I'll ask you the question. Have you received any information or done any research on the Centers of Disease Control in the U.S. relative to any outbreaks of salmonella connected to backyard hens?
Yes, through you, Madam Speaker. We are aware that the CDC has reported an outbreak of salmonella that they've tied back to the existence of backyard hens. As at the end of July, there's been 961 cases in 48 states, 215 hospitalizations, 1 death, all related to a variety of strains of salmonella.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Campbell.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. So, to Ms. Cook, how will you, how will you determine if the pilot is successful?
Through you, Madam Speaker, if a pilot
by, number of eggs laid or something like that, or production, or?
If a pilot were adopted by council, then we would determine a set of performance metrics that would allow us to report back on the outcomes of that pilot, would include access to a survey, feedback from the public, and if council was interested in the volume of eggs produced by said backyard hens, we would be happy to include that metric.
So if we agree to the pilot, you're going to come up with some performance metrics. Is that what I heard?
Sorry, through you, Madam Speaker.
Sorry, if we agree to the pilot, you're going to come up with performance metrics such as?
Through you, Madam Speaker, I would suggest making sure we've got captured any complaints around noise, nuisance, so basically the neighbor complaints. I think we'd have to talk to the medical officer of health to see if there was any ability for us to capture any illness-related complaints. Some of these things are very difficult. We get complaints in various parts of the city about rats every year due to construction. So we'd have to think through what other metrics we would be reporting out on to say whether the pilot was, and I don't know that it would be a success or not a success, but it would be about mitigating or managing if any nuisance arose from the pilot. So those metrics would be around community impacts.
So if we have chickens in the pilot, will people be required to pay a fee to have the chickens?
Through you, Madam Speaker, certainly, Councillor Campbell, our report does not propose a pilot, but I understand a pilot is of interest. So we would take the guidance from council on what they would like to see happen. I would expect that there would be some level of registration required, so we would know where the backyard hens were happening, a certain restriction on the number of hens kept, and other performance standards, including proper safe housing for the hens.
Right.
So I would see a pilot including a number of those things.
So if by chance this passes, there is a pilot, and then for whatever reasons it's deemed successful, and we have chickens in 44 wards, how much extra staff would you have to hire to monitor the extra the chickens?
So through
No, if you didn't listen to the question. The question was, if we go to 44 wards after the pilot, how much extra staff would you have to hire?
So through you, Madam Speaker, that would be directly derived from the nature of the issues we were needing to address. If we had if there was a pilot and if we had issues with chickens run amok around the city and there was a draw on our animal services staff, then that would be part of the discussion. If the chickens or the backyard hens were causing community nuisance and we had to deal and mitigate some of those things, that may have a different result. We may run a pilot and have none of those things and it would require no staff. Unfortunately, at this point, I can't give you specifics.
But it could result in hiring an extra 10 or 15 staff, perhaps, or 10 staff. I mean,
through you, Madam Speaker, I would certainly hope that that would not be the case, but we just don't know what the impacts and community issues would be around.
So is it could we look to other municipalities that have chickens and see what extra staff they had to implement and hire?
So through you, Madam Speaker, we have spoken to a number of other municipalities that do permit, either on a pilot or permanent basis, the existence of backyard hen flocks, and they have not reported any notable community issues or staff resource issues.
What would those municipalities have been?
There's New York City, Vancouver, Chicago, Brampton, Niagara Falls, Waterloo, Ottawa, Kingston. We don't have information that any of those cities have had an extraordinary volume of issues.
And so in those municipalities, how prevalent are backyard pens?
That's a great question. Through you, Madam Speaker, I don't know the volumes that they have. That certainly would be something that we would have to look at vis-a-vis the size of our city and the volume of uptake.
All right, well, that answers my questions on the chicken issue. Thank you.
Councillor Robinson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Just back me up. It's been a few months. So was this debated at the licensing committee, this issue of this pilot idea?
No. Through you, Madam Speaker, the report in front of you actually was dealing with prohibited animals and adding additional animals to our prohibited animals list in Chapter 349, as well as setting out a criteria for prohibited animals and dealing with the educational mobile live animal programs. Chickens, backyard hens are on our list of prohibited animals.
They're on your list of prohibited animals.
Correct.
And I guess for a good reason, you researched that. Why are they on your list of prohibited animals?
Through you, Madam Speaker, there's a lot of animals on this list, and a lot of it deals with, it's historical for this list. We did not just create it and just add chickens or backyard hens, and they do exist on many, if not all, other municipalities that have prohibited animals lists. And part of the criteria around looking at prohibited animals is impact to neighbors, community, safety, health and safety, ability to care for the animals, which is important as well from an animal welfare standpoint, that they have access to the appropriate veterinarian services. So for a variety of those things, we've actually outlined some criteria that we apply to the prohibited animal list in this report.
So it wasn't discussed at the licensing committee. There was no deputations, there was no public hearing or public input on this pilot concept?
Through you, Madam Speaker, I don't recall a specific discussion about a backyard hen pilot. I will say through the course of the consultations on this item, there were discussions brought forward from the community about backyard hens.
So there's been a public meeting? There has been an official city public meeting on this?
Not specifically on a pilot project or program to allow backyard hens, no. There was public consultation on the animals bylaw specifically related to the prohibited animals, and we did have a fair bit of feedback, about over almost 2,400 respondents on a survey, including 2 public consultations. The issue of backyard hens was discussed through those consultations writ large as part of
the
yes,
big picture.
but as a pilot project specifically, no, ma'am.
Okay, that's very clear. Thank you. And my understanding is, I learned this from another councillor. The Humane Society doesn't support backyard hens. Do you know if that's true?
I'm sorry, Councillor Robinson.
My understanding from another councillor is that the Humane Society does not support backyard hens. Do you know if that's accurate?
Did they?
No. Okay. Do you know if, my understanding, again, I don't know a lot about these matters, but hens lay eggs for only 2 to 5 years, and then there's a tendency for the owners to want to get rid of the hens, and so they tend to, I guess they can't slaughter them in their backyard, which I'm happy to hear. But they end up sending them to shelters like the Humane Society, so they're overloaded with unwanted chickens. Is that true, or have you ever?
Through you, Madam Speaker, I'm not aware of the Humane Society's direct engagement on the backyard hen issue, nor an overrun. I know when we have ended up with backyard hens or chickens in our care, we've made arrangements with farmers and others outside of the city to take them.
Okay.
And unfortunately, I'm not completely educated on the duration of the egg-laying time for backyard hens or their ultimate disposition afterwards.
Okay, and are roosters allowed? Are roosters part of this?
No, through you, Madam Speaker, that's a different type of bird, and we would. I don't think it's through you, Madam Speaker. I don't want to answer about the reproductive business of chickens. But what we, in the context of a pilot, what we would recommend is that roosters are not permitted.
Okay.
Naturally because of the noise from whatever source.
Have you heard anything about accidental rooster acquisition where at a very young age it's difficult to determine? Because again, I've heard this via other parties that it's problematic, and so people buy roosters unknowingly. Not aware of that? Okay, by the look on your face, that's my impression.
True.
Okay.
You got me on that one.
Well, again, it's just what I'm hearing, so I'm just wanting to vet it through you. And then lastly, I guess similar to Councillor Campbell, I have trouble in my ward getting MLS officers out to do kind of run-of-the-mill things, and no criticism at all. I think there's a bit of a resource challenge, but having said that, there's a lot of things that frustrate my neighborhoods that aren't getting addressed as quickly as I would like to see them getting addressed. It takes a few emails. So how would this put additional pressure on, and maybe it's not a fair question, additional pressure on your resource challenges?
So through you, Madam Speaker, I mean, we're all taxed with everybody wanting or needing more and us managing with the resources that we have. And I understand that's not a criticism. I feel the frustration, and I know we try diligently to meet timelines, and it's a challenge at certain times.
Well, thank you, Councillor Robinson. You're way over time.
Oh, that was my fault. So as far as any impact on...
I was just enjoying the roosters, turkeys, whatever.
As far as resources, I don't know.
Councillor Karygiannis?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I was wondering if Colonel Sanders has been, through you to staff, if Colonel Sanders has been consulted.
Through you, Madam Speaker, he was certainly welcome to answer our public survey, sir, if he was so inclined.
Now, I understand that we're not allowing the male species of the animal to be in the city. I was wondering if you can elaborate a little bit on that, please.
So through you, Madam Speaker, as I referenced earlier, currently our report is dealing with amendments to Chapter 349 and prohibited animals. The discussion that commenced in July was around the possibility of a pilot related to backyard hens. We would, if that pilot is approved, we would look at setting out performance standards and rules governing that. And yes, one of those considerations...
Hold on, please. I'm going to put your time on hold. There's an awful lot of noise. Members of council? Please, no clucking.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
So
go ahead.
So through you, Madam Speaker, we have not been directed to create a pilot. We haven't laid out all of the rules. This was focused on, the discussion has been around if we were to permit, council was to permit a pilot for backyard hens, our position would be that would be excluding anything other than the backyard hens, which would include the exclusion of roosters.
But through the Speaker to staff, don't you think that it is also appropriate that, I mean, you know, if you want to keep the family together and all that stuff, that you also allow the male species of the animals to be there?
Through you, Madam Speaker, certainly, sir, we'd be welcome to have a discussion about the appropriate participants in any backyard hen program, noting, though, that we would recommend a limit on the number of hens that were permitted to be kept. And we would have to study the impacts of whether a rooster in the hen house would be appropriate or not.
Well, I mean, a rooster in the hen house is, I was told when I was small and I was growing up, and that would be appropriate. I mean, you cannot have a house without a male species. I mean, you can, but I mean, that again?
So through you,
was that
Madam
again?
Speaker, it's not so much that we would seek to be discriminatory. It would simply be the issue of managing noise and the impact on neighbors should a rooster be on the property, and the early morning wake-up calls that the rest of the neighborhood may not wish to have.
So are you trying to tell us and alluding to that the chickens make less noise than the rooster does, or they make equal noises? Through the speaker to staff. I'd like an explanation.
Through you, Madam Speaker, we can, if we're directed to do the pilot, we can certainly go away and determine the noise levels of the various types of birds that may be permitted. As it stands right now, the question was around, has not yet been floored, but the discussion has been around the allowing of a pilot for backyard hens. We have not been asked to contemplate, or you can direct an exemption to allow roosters. If we were to run a pilot with backyard hens, our intention would be to not include roosters, irrespective of breaking up the family, as it were.
So you're not discriminating against the male of the species?
Through you, Madam Speaker, no, I love them all equally.
Is that my time's up, Madam Speaker, or we have 5 minutes? My time's up?
You still have a minute and a half.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you. Appreciate that. Now, I was wondering, through the Speaker to staff, I was wondering if you can contemplate what would Colonel Sanders say about the male part of the species, if they should be there or not. I mean,
come on. I mean,
I'm just wondering, have you had any...
Well, through you, Madam Speaker, I'm sure some of them are tender and sweet and others are tough and crusty. I'm not sure exactly which side one would fall on versus the other, sir.
But through the Speaker, and I know this comes from my good friend, Councillor Holiday, and he wants me to ask this question. I'm just wondering, if we don't have a rooster, how can we have eggs? And I'm not sure if what came first, the chicken or the egg. So we do need roosters, I mean, in the pilot project. Am I incorrect in that?
No. So through you, Madam Speaker, my understanding, and there are people who are far more educated on the keeping of backyard flocks, that a rooster is not necessarily required for the promulgation of said eggs.
Said species. I was wondering, would you be agreeable that maybe this needs to be studied further by the Licensing and Standards Committee? Maybe this should be deferred back for us to take a look at if we should be allowing roosters on the premises.
So through you, Madam Speaker, certainly, as I mentioned, this report did not contemplate nor did it recommend a pilot regarding backyard hens. We will be happy to accept the direction of council should you feel that a more deliberate discussion and research is done in respect to the performance standards around a pilot versus otherwise.
Okay, your time is up now. Thank you. Okay. Councillor Holiday, you're very anxious to ask questions.
I'm just standing to
You've been
stretch,
standing for 5 minutes.
in this chair for a while, but thank you, Speaker. Through you to the Executive Director. We prohibit a bunch of animals in the city, but we also permit a number of animals. What are some of the more common animals that we have, and how would they be similar? Cats, dogs, would that be fair to say?
Okay, hold on. Councillor Mihevik, Councillor Karygiannis, stop. Everyone was quiet when you spoke, Councillor Karygiannis.
I do have a point in my questions.
Okay, you can start all over. Okay.
Thank you, Speaker.
Okay.
I wonder if the Executive Director could comment on some of the animals that we do permit and what the similarities are.
Through you, Madam Speaker, certainly regular domestic animals, as you mentioned, dogs, cats, bunny rabbits, guinea pigs, hamsters, pigeons are allowed to be kept in the city, which is more of a direct relation to chickens.
Is it fair to say the majority, or I think everything that I'm hearing, are pretty much pets? You could call them a pet. Do they live indoors?
Through you, Madam Speaker, certainly we encourage people to keep their cats indoors, and we have requirements in our animals bylaw regarding proper enclosures and housing for dogs if they are left outdoors. So we do require proper humane treatment.
But for the most part, it's pets that we're talking about in an urban setting, And for the most part, they are things that live indoors with families, with humans, and they're treated as pet. Does anyone eat their pet? I mean, as a matter of habit or course or normalcy here? I don't think so.
Through you, Madam Speaker, I'm sure that was rhetorical, and I would certainly hope not. And yes, I would say the majority of pets that are kept in the city are kept indoors.
So what I'm getting at is, would it be fair to say that we're talking about livestock in this instance? I mean, these are animals that are brought here for the purpose of food production. I don't think they're pets. I think we're talking about livestock.
So through you, Madam Speaker, certainly when we look at our list of prohibited animals, and I'm happy to give you a rundown of what many of those are, do fall into the livestock and exotic or wild animals, non-Indigenous.
Would it be fair to say that we're heading down a path with what I hear about this proposal to introduce backyard hens? We are talking about introducing livestock or, I don't know, urban farming or something along that lines. What's to say I don't want to have a goat? And, for the reasons of that, that we've talked about today, they're pretty quiet, they have a little patch of grass. Where do we stop? Can I have a cow? I like milk.
Ducks.
I mean, it's rhetorical, obviously, but is there any controls? Where do we draw the line?
So through you, Madam Speaker, the line gets drawn here, sir. City Council, I didn't mean that facetiously, City Council has the authority to dictate what is permitted and or prohibited to be kept in the city of Toronto.
Are you aware of any livestock, other than maybe in a factory for a limited amount of time? Is there anyone that raises livestock here in a household setting?
Through you,
Legally?
Madam Speaker, we generally no, but I will say we have had occasions where little pot-bellied pigs have been dropped off at animal services. So there are some people who are making some interesting choices as far as pets go. It's not for me to judge.
Right.
But we have had some cases where little pigs have been dropped off.
So we're talking about livestock, and so that's the turning point of the conversation. And would it be fair to say that we are treading on new ground here? We're not talking about pets and prohibited animals. We're actually talking about a different category of animal for a different purpose, which is to create food, I think. This is different.
So through you, Madam Speaker, we're not having from my understanding of the nature of this discussion, it is around a move and a consideration of urban farming in urban environments. I know that dialogue is happening in various places around North America at least. This is the first one of these conversations that I've had. So
fair enough. Would it be fair to say that a dozen eggs is $2 or $3? 30 cents an egg?
Yeah.
So with that in mind, could you tell us a little bit about what you know about the costs to properly raise and take care of 4 hens in the backyard?
Through you, Madam Speaker, on this point, I would be guessing. I think there may be some colleagues that you have that are more informed on that.
Would it be fair to say that it is far, far in excess the cost of going into a store to purchase a dozen eggs that might probably be a day or two old if they were shipped quickly over here? And with 3 or 4 hens, you can only produce 3 or 4 eggs a day. So it would take 3 or 4 days to acquire those eggs. Would it be fair to say that people are not doing this on an economic basis, or this notion of, it's easily accessible food, that in fact it is a very expensive way to get eggs, that it's far cheaper just to go out and buy an egg?
So through you, Madam Speaker, I don't think I'd be properly placed to break it down on a unit cost. I would say that should a pilot be permitted, there are expectations of the city, or would be expectations of the city, that the animals are properly housed, properly fed, properly maintained, and whatever those costs are, those costs are. But on a per unit basis, I guess that's the value is in the eye of the beholder.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor DiCiano.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Let's just try and get through some of this fear-mongering. To Ms. Cook, certainly you mentioned that there are several municipalities in Ontario that have been allowing backyard chickens, Niagara Falls being one of those, for over 20 years.
Through you, Madam Speaker, we are aware of a number of jurisdictions, yes, sir.
And how many people have died of salmonella?
Through you, Madam Speaker, I wouldn't have that number, but I'm gathering probably none.
How many people have been violently sick? How many culls of chickens have we had in the last 20 years in Ontario from backyard chickens?
So through you, Madam Speaker, that's information that I would not have had on hand.
Nothing you brought up on Google or anything that we can see that was a massive, public health issue created by backyard chickens?
So through you, Madam Speaker, in that respect, we did look at the public health, and we did talk to the Chief Medical Officer of Health about the public health concerns around backyard hens. That's where we landed on the information that came out of the Center for Disease Control out of the United States regarding the salmonella outbreak tied back to backyard hen flocks. Other than that, we believe there have been some cases over time, but nothing significant. I will also note, out of fairness, that in those same materials, it was discussed that proper hygiene and proper hand washing are the things that need to be done in order to avoid contracting salmonella from any source, including backyard hens.
Right. Hand, foot, and mouth disease. It's a young child can walk in one of our parks today and easily contract hand, foot, and mouth disease just from dog feces or anything like that. That's something that can happen, very common here in Toronto. We don't ban dogs for that reason. We manage the problem in terms of the health outcomes.
So through you, Madam Speaker, again, not treading into the shoes of the Chief Medical Officer of Health, but I do know, and from my conversations with her, those issues that arise are typically around the lack of appropriate hygiene or sufficient hygiene, hand washing, of course, being the primary protector from those types of diseases.
Right. And are you aware that in Niagara Falls last year, there was 500 dog complaints with respect to noise, and only 10 for chickens? That is a municipality that's had chickens allowed for 20 years. Are you aware of that statistic? 500 complaints for dogs and 10 for chickens in terms of noise?
Through you, Madam Speaker, no, I'm not aware of their statistics, though I would say that would fall in line with the statistics that we have. We do receive many more complaints about dogs due to the volume of dogs relative to the complaints we've had about chickens. Chicken-related complaints have been about 100 a year.
Right. And I know that there's no one here from public health. If you can't answer this, I completely understand. But given that chickens eat bugs and critters at a high rate, and that mosquitoes carry West Nile, would we be able to correlate that if chickens were allowed, you'd have less mosquitoes, so the risk for West Nile in the city would go down?
Through you, Madam Speaker, well, to whether the chickens, we'd have enough chickens to eat enough mosquitoes to take away the issue of West Nile and or the other conditions that breed mosquitoes and the level of rain we've had this year.
Right.
I think it will be a tough corollary to draw, but it's a good effort.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Doucette.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm going to start on with the hens, and then we'll go on to the other reason we actually did this report. Are residents allowed to keep bees in the city?
Through you, Madam Speaker, I'm not aware of any bylaw governing the prohibition of bees, apiaries.
Yeah.
Provincially. They're provincially permitted. I have animal services.
So bees are allowed to be kept in the city, and am I correct that that bylaw specifies how far the apiary has to be away from a property line? So therefore, the size of the property?
Through you, Madam Speaker, we believe that's governed provincially, and we do believe there are those performance standards.
And also my understanding is that when you have a hive, you have to register it with the province. See, I've done my beekeeping course.
You are so good.
So you would be looking, with the chickens, you would be looking at something maybe along that line, possibly the size of the property, how far from the property line the coops could be kept. Would that sort of be where you're coming from?
Yeah, through you, Madam Speaker, certainly when I mention performance standards, yes, it's about area of the property. We also want to make sure we stay away from accessory structure issues and the need for my good friend here from Toronto Building, as well as other standards around maintenance and mitigating community or neighbor impacts.
Now, we heard some concerns about when the hen has finished laying eggs, what people will do with them. Are you aware that there's a company called Rent the Chicken,
Through you, Madam Speaker, I have become aware of that company.
And are you aware, for roughly $600, you can rent a coop, 4 hens, no roosters, and they will deliver it to you, and they provide you with the food, they set it up for you, and at the end of the season, they take them away. Are you aware of this?
Through you, Madam Speaker, I believe a very wise counselor actually made me aware of that.
So also on their website, it indicates that if you have 4 chickens, this is an answer to Councillor Holliday's question, you will get between 8 and 14 eggs per week from 4 chickens. That's pretty good. Would you agree?
Through you, Madam Speaker, I like my eggs. Clearly, that sounds like a good number.
And are you aware that these eggs, because you know what your chicken is eating, they can eat some of your food scraps from your kitchen, which actually reduces what goes into your green bin, which reduces what we as a city have to pick up. They have 1/3 less cholesterol. They are 1/4 less saturated fats and 2 times more omega-3 fatty acids than the eggs bought in a store. Doesn't that sound healthy? Omega. Doesn't that sound healthy?
That sounds extremely healthy.
All right. Now, on to the next topic. This report actually came before us because some councillors approached you. We had concerns about some of the companies out there taking animals away from where they live and sleep to birthday parties, to schools, to petting farms. That was the reason this report came forward in the beginning. Is that correct?
Yes, through you, Madam Speaker, we were concerned about the proliferating of prohibited animals and exotic animals in particular being used in birthday parties and other quote-unquote educational circumstances that were questionably not educational.
And do you feel that the report before us today will alleviate that concern where in the media we've seen animals lying on concrete floors with no water or food or shelter? You feel that this report will protect those animals being taken away from their home to be exhibited and handled by people who don't necessarily know how to handle them properly?
Yes, through you, Madam Speaker, this was a continuation of a report we did earlier. We did undertake consultation with the companies that do these mobile live animal shows, as well as others, and this report would prohibit that type of activity with prohibited animals being used for that purpose. Non-prohibited animals could still be used for educational purposes into the schools and whatnot, but not prohibited animals. And that's what the intention of this report is.
My last question.
Last question.
You agree that the date to sort of stop this from happening is now January 1st of 2018 rather than July 1st of this year, because that allows the companies who have already done programming to stop their programming?
Yes, through you, Madam Speaker. When this report first came forward, we had moved it to January because we had heard from some of the operators and, reputable operators that they had schools and whatnot booked in the early fall. So we felt January 1 was a reasonable amount of time for them to make amendments to their programming.
Thank you, Councillor Doucette. Councillor Burnside has allowed us how Speaker Nunziata could go next. Madam Speaker.
Okay, thank you. For a councillor that represented the stockyards, where I have a lot of pigs and everything there, chickens and running on people's front lawns, I've dealt with it. But just a question. First of all, the report that we have on licensing, there was at licensing, there was no motion. We did not make a motion on a pilot for backyard chickens, anything, correct?
Through you, Madam Speaker, that is correct. Madam Speaker.
So now I understand there's a movement to move a motion to have a pilot, but we're voting on a pilot when you have not submitted in a report, correct?
That's correct.
No report. And even a pilot in the specific wards that are being proposed, there has been no public consultation.
That is correct.
So, do you not think that if we're going to even try a pilot in 4 wards, that there should be some sort of consultation on what the criteria would be and who would be eligible? I mean, we go and get petitions and do polls and surveys for permit parking, front yard parking, and everything else, and we're going to allow chickens in backyards without consultation?
Through you, Madam Speaker, I do agree. I think public consultation and engagement
Right.
is important in all the work we do.
And even if the pilot is only in 4 specific wards, the residents of that ward should have input. And if somebody applies, I assume that they would be applying, correct? Or it's not, everybody's just going to have chickens in their backyard with no criteria, nothing, just throw chickens in the backyard?
No, so through you, Madam Speaker, certainly if I was directed to develop a pilot regarding backyard hens, we would make sure that we had appropriate rules and processes in place to ensure that it was managed and that we could report back out on it.
So the rules would be and should be is that if somebody is applying for a specific use or applying for a permit, that residents in the area on the street would have input on it, just like they do everything else that we ask residents, correct?
Through you, Madam Speaker, certainly, Madam Speaker, that would be something that we would have to discuss in the context of forming what a pilot would look like, how it would be operated, the metrics we would report back on, the potential resource implications, if any. Ideally, we need time to do all of that work.
So it's really premature to even move a motion to have a pilot without it sending it back to licensing and asking you when you get some time to bring forward a report, because you have so many reports that you have deadlines on that are priority, that you would report back to licensing and at that point have deputations.
Through you, Madam Speaker, certainly, and thank you for acknowledging, Madam Speaker, that we have a large volume of work that Council is waiting for us to deliver on, and we are not going to hit all of those deadlines. I can attest to that right now. So certainly, it's a body of work that we want to make sure we did thoroughly and properly with the appropriate consultation. Having it properly vetted through committee and allowing deputation would be the better way to do it, and perhaps given the time of year, it may be the more prudent course to take.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Nunziata. Madam Speaker, Councillor Burnside, thank you for waiting.
It's my pleasure, Deputy Speaker. Through you to staff, just want to follow up more on Councillor Holliday's line of questioning, if you will, regarding the prohibited animals. So chickens are currently a prohibited animal, yes?
Yes, through you, Madam Speaker, they are.
Okay. And what was the purpose for putting chickens on that list?
Through you, Madam Speaker, the prohibited animals list goes back decades, and many of the animals on the list are those, as referenced previously, those that would be considered livestock, those that are exotic or non-Indigenous to Ontario, and it includes goats, sheep, pigs, cattle, moths, tigers, leopards, kangaroos, skunks, weasels, horses, donkeys. So a variety of animals.
So is it primarily a livestock issue?
It's a livestock. It's in the context of backyard hens. I would capture them in that livestock bucket, if you were, though it's under a different type of Latin.
But not because they're they could potentially be in certain size cages. Because I'm wondering why these traveling road shows, if you will, couldn't bring chickens in, or for educational purposes, they're not allowed to bring them into schools, right? So I'm trying to understand how the two policies would work together.
Yeah. So through you, Madam Speaker, so the prohibited animal list is a list of animals that are absolutely not permitted to be in the city unless they are exempted. And in the bylaw, there's a list of exemptions. Riverdale Zoo, High Park Zoo, Toronto Zoo, the Toronto Wildlife Centre. And as well, there was an exemption in there for allowing people to bring in prohibited animals for no more than 3 days for educational purposes. That exemption is the one that we are recommending be eliminated, so prohibited animals can no longer be brought around into schools or anywhere for that matter.
And notwithstanding what's going on with this particular issue, chickens would then be totally prohibited.
So chickens, backyard hens are totally prohibited right now unless it's under an exemption.
So they wouldn't have an exemption is what I'm trying to get at.
Correct.
Correct.
Sorry,
So do you not
who
see
wouldn't have the exemption?
The chickens, like for educational purposes.
Right, so any prohibited animal for educational purposes with the adoption of this report, actually the adoption of the last report, is no longer permitted in the city. No prohibited animals for educational purposes. That's ended.
So the chickens it would be more than a livestock issue then.
So the discussion that's been happening here around the backyard hens is a pilot. We would have to carve out, City Council would have to carve out an exemption for those people who wanted to participate in an approved pilot in order for them to possess those animals.
But we wouldn't have an exemption for those to use even those same chickens for educational purposes.
Correct.
Does that make sense to you?
Through you,
It's okay.
Madam
It's okay. You don't understand.
Doesn't make sense to you, does it? No.
Thank you, Councillor Burnside. Councillor Holland.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, through you. So I'll just first ask legal a few questions about the prohibited animals, and I understand this goes under guinea fowl, I believe, and so they are classified as prohibited, correct?
That's correct, and it's galliforms, to be precise.
It is?
Galliforms is the scientific or Latin name.
Okay, thank you. And so if there were a pilot and it were to move forward, what is the process in terms of legal or the exemption process in order to do that?
As the bylaw currently prohibits hens or chickens in the City of Toronto, we would have to amend the bylaw to create an exception or exemption to that prohibition. I understand that it's being discussed as a temporary pilot project, so we would then have to create a mechanism to repeal those exemptions effective the date set by Council.
Okay, and then it would be repealed and then put back and then...
That's correct. So if a date is set to end the pilot, then that would be the date that the exemptions would fall out of the bylaw and the prohibitions would come back in force for the specified wards.
Okay, thank you very much. And then through to Ms. Cook. So I mean, I was on budget for many, many years, and MLS was always an area where I would say most councillors always wanted to see more staff. And because I would say the number one complaints I get in Ward 35 are MLS related, I can't imagine
Councillor Holland, hold on, I can't even hear you. Members of council, please. Councillor Fletcher. Councillor Layton.
Oh, Mike.
Okay.
Okay, so I can't imagine that you're not overrun. I know our MLS staff are doing amazing work in Scarborough and for Ward 35, but it's tough. We have a lot of calls. It takes a while for people to get out, not because they are slow, it's because actually they're just overrun. And I can't imagine adding this onto it. Would you not feel that we would have to absolutely put more resources, more staffing into the, because governments don't like to take risk, they always run forward.
So through you, Madam Speaker, certainly it would tie up our time to create the pilot, to monitor the pilot, and then the outcomes of any enforcement or particularly on my animal services side of the house, responses to deal with any animal issues. I was asked previously, I don't know what that number would be. And I appreciate your recognition that we're doing the best we can with what we have, and everything else we add on just draws on the same people doing more things, and we really need to work on prioritizing where we need to spend our time. But I can't give an answer as to what that number would be or what that impact would be out of fairness, though there would be an impact in just starting to set it up and monitoring.
Okay. And
the space.
And you,
Sorry, through you, Madam Speaker, as well, Carlton just reminded me as well, we'd need to make provision for where to temporarily house any animals that came into our care. We've kind of been doing it ad hoc right now,
know.
yeah, there are some of those additional ancillary costs.
Right, and that would lead into my next question. So we know that the production laying period of hens is 2 years, but they live for 10. So what happens to the hens after their production laying period? I mean, because a lot of people may have small children and they don't want to take them in to be slaughtered. And so what generally happens with these hens after the 2-year mark?
So through you, Madam Speaker, I mean, that's going to come down to the people who own the hens. From a city perspective, my concern would be if people started returning them into us,
right,
which does happen with owner surrender, or as we saw a couple of years ago in Hyde Park where it came and it was let loose in the pond. I mean, that would be my concern of what that disposition of those animals would be.
And we're going to be overrun at MLS. And then so I'll go into my next question in terms of, is there a lot of, I know that the average cost of running, I think this is the problem what happens with a lot of people. They get excited about it. I mean, I buy small flock eggs. I don't eat a lot. I buy 6 at a time. Yep, they're expensive, but you get your small flock, which is local. If people want that, they should look in that direction. I've heard, we verified on a couple of places where they've had backyard farming. I'm wrapping up my question. Is the cost is actually around $40 a dozen, and so when people get into it, they're all excited, but then they realize the cost, and then the fact is what happens to all these chickens. And
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, through you, Madam Speaker, and certainly Councillor Holliday was asking similar questions, and I'm sorry I was not fully up to speed on unit cost for backyard raised eggs and hens. But as I said earlier, our expectation and our standards around any pilot would have to ensure that the appropriate animal welfare and neighbor nuisance issues were addressed, and that would have a cost.
Thank you. Councillor Perruzza, you're next.
Just a couple of questions, because I've been sitting here diligently listening to folks describing this operation. You know, these 2 little white chickens, right? You sit there, and out comes this little white egg, and then you pet it, and it goes back to sleep. And it's like the cleanest, sweetest, tastiest operation you could ever imagine. So you talked a little earlier about salmonella, rodents, coyotes, chickens running wild. But I just want to turn your mind to how does one keep a couple of chickens in their backyard?
Through you, Madam Speaker, they would be required to build a reasonably sized, appropriately sized coop and make sure that the hens were properly housed and protected.
Okay, so now they have to build something that's completely enclosed, because it's not like you can train a chicken, right? You can't say to the chicken, no, you can't fly out and fly into the neighbor's yard. No, you can't go poop on his veranda. You got to stay in the little coop here, right?
I don't think the executive director is an expert on chickens.
Speaker, I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah, I know.
You may understand this.
No,
Could
I
you
don't
stop my
understand.
time, because you've interrupted me, right?
Yeah. Pardon?
Could you stop my time or give me my time back?
Go ahead, 20 seconds, Councillor Perruzza.
So,
But please ask a question.
I'm trying to understand how one would keep chickens in their backyard. So you build a coop. So appropriately sized for 4 hens, how big would the coop need to be?
You have to be able to spray, yeah. Through you, Madam Speaker, that would be some of the requirements.
Let's just say it's a fair size.
I'd say about 4 wingspans.
Okay. Now, if you don't want to be cruel, to your chickens, you would in our climate, given that we have like a summer climate and then we got a winter climate, You would want them in the summertime to have some mobility outdoors, some fresh air, I'm assuming, some ability to move around. And then in the wintertime, when it's really cold, you would want an indoor facility of some kind for them that it's got some heat in it. You don't want your chickens to freeze, or you don't want to find your little white egg in the morning all frozen up like an ice cube, right?
Through you, Madam Speaker, if we're directed to create a pilot, certainly some of those performance standards or requirements would be around the animal welfare, the appropriate housing, appropriate feeding, and we would look to experts in the field to give us guidance on what that needs to look like.
Now, how many times do you have to feed a chicken a day?
Through you, Madam Speaker, I think they graze all day, but I am not the chicken feeding expert.
Okay. And your chickens need to drink.
I would suspect they would.
And then they need to be cleaned at some point, and you'd have to maintain them. So it would be safe to say that you couldn't pick up and go down for 2 weeks to Jamaica, right, to some swanky club there, and leave your chickens all alone by themselves, correct?
Through you, Madam Speaker, we would require in any pilot the appropriate measures be taken to ensure animal welfare. So I would trust that if anyone has gone to the trouble to build the coop and get the hens, that they would take the appropriate steps to ensure that they were well maintained and cared for, and we would require that in the pilot.
Right. And requiring it means you'd inspect how often each and every one.
Through you, Madam Speaker,
Like
we don't
how would you determine, if someone was being cruel to chickens, and then you'd have to go back every once in a while and go take a look?
So, through you, Madam Speaker.
Councillor Perruzza, please, you're not allowing the staff to answer any of the questions. You're just rambling on. Let the staff answer.
Through you, Madam Speaker, we would deal with any animal mistreatment, cruelty to chicken issues, complaints, as we do with other animal-related issues, by complaint basis primarily. If something comes to our attention, then we would investigate appropriately.
And let's take a look at that for a second. How quickly do you get out to a particular standards complaint today?
So, through you, Madam Speaker, depending on the nature of the complaint, sir, will dictate the speed that we can respond. I can share that our animal services crew, though small, are mighty, and when it comes to issues of animal welfare, they respond relatively quickly. On the other side, with property standards, due to the volumes, et cetera, we're much longer in responding. Our response times really vary by the priority given to the nature of the complaint or the issue.
Okay, so in terms of time, what could those time lags be?
So, through you, Madam
That's
Speaker.
your last question?
Our animal services mobile teams, if it's an issue of animal distress or animal cruelty, can respond relatively quickly. That's one of the few groups I've got that are actually operating about 22 hours a day, but there's only a few of them covering the city. They have responded within an hour, 2 hours to some cases where it's been an animal cruelty, animal injured, or animal in distress. In other cases where it's not that nature, then it does take longer, 24 hours, 48 hours. It really varies.
Thank you. Recess to 6:30.